Before we continue, like and subscribe to the channel if you genuinely enjoy this content, and tell me where are you listening from. I love reading every comment from my watchers. Now let's begin. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, predictable rhythm of a life lived according to a strict and unwavering schedule. It is the life of Immanuel Kant, a man who, for over 40 years, barely set foot outside his sleepy Prussian hometown of Königsberg, a man whose daily routine was so famously, so legendarily precise that the citizens of his town were said to set their watches by the moment he emerged from his house for his afternoon walk. His life was a testament to order, a perfect clockwork existence almost entirely devoid of external drama, passion, or adventure. But beneath this calm, unassuming exterior, a revolution was brewing. A revolution of thought so profound that it would permanently alter the course of Western philosophy. For Kant was not just a quiet professor, he was a giant, an intellectual titan, who would take on the biggest questions of his time and, in answering them, would create a new and breathtaking map of the human mind and its relationship to reality. His quiet life was not a sign of a small mind. It was the necessary condition for a mind that was about to embark on the most ambitious and most difficult of all possible journeys. For the first part of his career, Kant was a respected but not yet revolutionary thinker. He was a practitioner of what he would later call dogmatic philosophy, a tradition handed down from the great rationalist thinkers like Leibniz and Wolff. This was a school of thought that had a profound faith in the power of pure reason. It believed that the human intellect, through logic and deduction alone, without any need for sensory experience, could uncover the ultimate truths of the universe, that it could prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. To understand the scale of Kant's eventual revolution, we must first understand the great philosophical war that had been raging for over a century before him. On one side of this war were the Rationalists, philosophers like René Descartes in France, Baruch Spinoza in Holland, and Gottfried Leibniz in Germany. They believed that all true, certain knowledge comes from the mind itself, that we are born with innate ideas, and that the confusing and often deceptive information we get from our senses must be treated with deep suspicion, for the path to truth was an inward one, a journey into the logical architecture of our own thoughts. On the other side of the battlefield were the Empiricists, thinkers like John Locke and George Berkeley in Britain. They argued the exact opposite, that all knowledge comes not from reason but from experience. The mind, they claimed, is a blank slate at birth, a tabula rasa, and all of our ideas, from the simplest to the most complex, are built up from the raw data provided by our five senses. For them, a thought without a corresponding sensory experience was a meaningless fiction. The path to truth was an outward one, a journey into the observable, tangible world. This great debate had reached a kind of stalemate, with both sides unable to vanquish the other, and it was into this stalemate that the final, most brilliant, and most devastating of the empiricists arrived, the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume was a man who took the principles of empiricism to their absolute, logical, and terrifying conclusion, and in doing so, he constructed a philosophical bomb that would shatter the foundations of both science and metaphysics. And it was the shockwave from this bomb that, in Kant's famous words, first awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Hume began with a simple but powerful idea. He argued that all of human knowledge can be divided into two categories, a division now known as Hume's fork. On one side of the fork are relations of ideas. These are truths of logic and mathematics. Like all bachelors are unmarried, or 3 times 5 is equal to half of 30. These statements are absolutely certain, but they are certain only because they don't actually tell us anything new about the world. They are just definitions, tautologies. They are true by their own internal logic. On the other side of the fork are matters of fact. These are statements about the world, like, the sun will rise tomorrow, or this stone is heavy. This is where all our real knowledge of reality lies. But Hume pointed out that because this knowledge comes only from experience, it can never be absolutely certain. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow only because it has risen every other day in our experience. But we have no logical proof that it absolutely must rise tomorrow. There is no contradiction in imagining that it won't. This was troubling enough. But Hume then took his skeptical argument one step further and aimed it at the very heart of all scientific and philosophical thought: the concept of causality, or cause and effect. We all believe that when one billiard ball strikes another, the first ball causes the second ball to move. We believe there is a necessary, unbreakable connection between the cause and the effect. But Hume, with a devastating simplicity, pointed out that we never actually see a cause. We never experience a necessary connection. All we ever see, Hume argued, is a constant conjunction of events. We see one event, the first ball moving, followed by another event, the second ball moving, and because we have seen this happen 1,000 times, our minds, out of sheer habit, create an expectation. We invent the idea of a necessary connection, a cause, but this idea does not come from the world outside us, it comes from the psychology inside us. Causality, he concluded, is nothing more than a feeling, a mental habit, an expectation born of repeated experience. The consequences of this argument were catastrophic. If cause and effect is just a psychological habit, then all of science, which is based on the discovery of universal and necessary laws of nature, is suddenly standing on a foundation of sand. We have no rational reason to believe that the laws of physics that worked yesterday will work tomorrow. Science is just a collection of our best guesses, a sophisticated form of habit. The entire edifice of human knowledge, from the simplest observation to the most complex scientific theory, seemed to be collapsing into a state of total, incurable skepticism. It was this argument that shattered Kant's peaceful, dogmatic world. He realized that Hume was right. We can never derive a necessary, universal law from experience alone. But at the same time, he knew that we do have knowledge that seems to be both necessary and universal, like the laws of mathematics and physics. This was the great contradiction that woke him from his slumber. Both the rationalists, who built their castles of pure reason in the air, and the empiricists, who had reduced all knowledge to a mere psychological habit, had failed. And so, Kant proposed a new beginning, a Copernican revolution in philosophy for centuries, he said. We have assumed that our knowledge must conform to objects, that our minds are passive mirrors, trying to create an accurate reflection of a world that is out there. But what if, he asked, we have been looking through the telescope from the wrong end? What if, instead of our minds conforming to objects, it is objects that must conform to our minds? What if the human mind is not a passive mirror, but an active instrument, a powerful tool that actively structures and organizes the reality it experiences? What if the very laws of nature that Hume could not find in the world out there are actually rules that our own minds impose upon the world? What if our minds are not just receiving reality, but are, in a very profound sense, creating it? This was the revolutionary new path that Kant set for philosophy. The central question was no longer, what can we know of the world, but was now the deeper, more fundamental question: how is knowledge itself even possible? The quiet man from Königsberg, the sleeping philosopher, was now wide awake, and he was about to embark on a great and difficult journey, a complete critique of the powers and the limits of human reason, in order to save philosophy from the dead end of skepticism and to place human knowledge, once and for all, on a firm and unshakable foundation. He would have to tear down the old world of thought and build a new one from the ground up, a world in which the human mind was no longer a mere spectator, but the active and powerful lawgiver of its own experience. Immanuel Kant, awakened from his slumber by the devastating skepticism of David Hume, knew that he could not simply glue the old world of philosophy back together. A more radical solution was needed, a complete rethinking of the very relationship between the human mind and the reality it seeks to understand. His solution was to propose a great and profound division in the very fabric of being, a distinction so powerful and so influential that it would shape the course of all philosophy that came after him. This is the foundation of his entire system, a concept he called Transcendental idealism. He asks us to imagine that all of reality is split into two distinct, non-overlapping realms. On one side, there is the world that we can know, the world of our experience, the sum total of everything we can possibly see, hear, touch, and think about. This, Kant calls the world of phenomena, the world of appearances. It is the world of science, of mathematics, of everyday life. It is the world of billiard balls, of falling apples, and of the sun rising in the morning. It is, in short, the only reality we will ever have direct access to. But the crucial and revolutionary part of Kant's idea is that this phenomenal world is not a direct, perfect, one-to-one copy of some external reality. It is, instead, a co-production, a joint venture between the raw, chaotic data that our senses receive from the outside world and the active, structuring, and organizing power of our own minds. Our mind does not passively receive reality like a photograph being taken. It actively constructs the world of our experience according to its own innate, unchangeable rules. Imagine your mind as like a sophisticated digital camera. The world outside is a chaotic flood of raw light and energy. The camera's sensor, like your senses, absorbs this raw, meaningless data. But then the camera's internal software kicks in. It takes that raw data and processes it, organizing it according to its own built-in rules, applying color correction, adjusting the focus, and arranging it all into a coherent, stable, and recognizable image. The final picture you see on the screen, the phenomenon, is a beautiful and reliable representation of the world, but it is not the raw, unprocessed reality itself. Kant is arguing that the human mind has its own kind of internal software, a universal operating system that we are all born with. We take the raw, chaotic data of our sensations, and our minds automatically process it, organizing it into the stable, predictable, and law-governed world of our experience. This is the phenomenal world. It is real to us. It is objective for us, but we must never forget that it is a reality that has been filtered through and fundamentally shaped by the very structure of our own consciousness. If the phenomenal world is the world of appearances, then what lies on the other side of the Great Divide? What is the source of all that raw sensory data? Kant says that we must logically assume that there is another realm, a world that exists independently of our minds, a world as it is in itself, before it has been processed by our mental software. This ultimate, unknowable reality he calls the world of noumena, or the thing in itself, distinct. This nominal world is the true, ultimate reality. But, and this is the devastating price of Kant's system, it is a world we can never, ever know. The moment we try to think about it, the moment we try to experience it, our mind software automatically kicks in, and it is instantly transformed into a phenomenon, into an appearance. The very act of observing changes the thing being observed. We are, in a sense, like a person born wearing an inescapable pair of rose-colored glasses. We can see the world, we can interact with it, we can make reliable predictions about it, but everything we see will always be rose-colored. We can, through logic, deduce that the world as it is in itself is probably not rose-colored, but we can never ever take the glasses off to see what it's really like. That original, untinted reality, the thing in itself, is forever beyond our grasp. Kant is not saying that the external world doesn't exist. He is certain that it does. He is simply saying that we can never have direct knowledge of its true, underlying nature. This brilliant, if humbling, distinction is Kant's great solution to the problem that Hume had posed. Hume had looked for the law of cause and effect in the world of experience, and quite rightly, had failed to find it there. Kant's solution is to say that Hume was simply looking in the wrong place. The law of causality is not a feature of the nominal world. The thing in itself, it is one of the built-in rules of our own mental software. It is a fundamental feature of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. This means that within the world of our experience, science is saved. The law that one event necessarily causes another is not just a psychological habit. It is a necessary, universal, and objective law of all possible appearances, because our minds are all built with the same fundamental operating system. We can be certain that the laws of nature will be the same for everyone and that they will not change tomorrow. We can have real, objective, and certain knowledge, not of ultimate reality, but of the shared structured reality that our own minds help to create. But this certainty comes at a tremendous price. In order to save the objectivity of science, Kant had to sacrifice the great, traditional ambitions of philosophy. The grand questions of metaphysics, about the ultimate nature of God, the freedom of the will, and the immortality of the soul, are now, in his system, fundamentally unanswerable. For if these things exist, they must exist in the nominal world, the world of ultimate reality, and that is a world to which our reason has no access. It is a land that is forever beyond the horizon of our knowledge. Kant has, in effect, drawn a firm and final line in the sand of human thought. He has secured the territory of science, giving it a firm and unshakable foundation within the world of phenomena, but he has done so by erecting a great impenetrable wall around it, a wall that separates the world we can know from the vast, mysterious, and silent world that we can only believe in, a world that we can think about but can never ever truly know. This great divide between the phenomenal and the noumenal is the foundational move of his entire philosophy, and it is the key to understanding everything that is to come. Having made his great and daring division of reality into the knowable phenomenal world and the unknowable noumenal world, Kant now faced his next great task. He had to reverse engineer the human mind, to take apart the engine of our experience and identify the specific tools, the cogs and gears, that our consciousness uses to construct our reality. If the mind is not a passive mirror but an active creator, then what are the rules of its creation? What is the universal software that we are all born with, that takes the raw, chaotic data of the senses and transforms it into a coherent world? He begins this project by making another crucial distinction. He argues that the mind's toolkit can be divided into two main components. First, there is what he calls our sensibility, our capacity to receive raw data from the outside world, and this sensibility has its own fundamental rules, which he calls the forms of intuition. Second, there is our understanding, our capacity to think and to form concepts about that raw data, and this understanding also has its own rules, which he calls the categories. For this part of our journey, we will focus on the first, most fundamental layer, the very foundation upon which all experience is built, the forms of intuition. Before Kant, philosophers had generally thought of space in one of two ways. For Isaac Newton, space was like a giant, infinite, and invisible container, an empty box in which all the objects of the universe existed. For Gottfried Leibniz, on the other hand, space was not a thing in itself, but was simply the set of all the possible relationships, the distances and directions, between objects. Kant, with his characteristic revolutionary genius, declared that both of these ideas were wrong. His claim was as simple as it was world-altering. Space, he argued, is not a property of the world out there at all. Space, Kant insists, is a fundamental structure of our own minds. It is the a priori form of our outer sense. It is the preloaded operating system, the great invisible grid upon which our mind must arrange all the data that comes to it from the outside world. Think of it like the desktop on a computer screen. You can have many different icons representing objects, and you can move them around, but you can never have an icon that is not on the desktop. The desktop itself is the necessary precondition for any icons to appear at all. In the same way, space is the necessary precondition for us to experience any external object. To prove this, he offers a simple but powerful thought experiment. Try, he says, to think of an object that does not exist in space. It's impossible. The very concept of an object implies a location, a set of spatial dimensions, but now try to do the opposite. Try to think of space itself empty of all objects. This, he says, is perfectly possible. You can imagine an empty, infinite void. This proves that space is more fundamental than the objects that appear within it. It is not something we learn from experience. It is something we bring to experience. It is one of the lenses in the inescapable glasses we are born wearing. This strange idea also provides a brilliant solution to a problem that had plagued philosophy for centuries. How is it possible that geometry, the mathematical study of space, can give us truths that are both absolutely certain and universal, a priori, and yet also seem to apply to the real world? Hume's skepticism suggested this was impossible. But Kant's answer is elegantly simple. The reason the laws of geometry are universally true for us is because geometry is nothing more than the study of the rules of our own spatial intuition. We are, in essence, studying the structure of our own minds. What Kant claims for space, he also claims for time. Time, he argues, is not a great cosmic river that we are all floating down. It is not an external feature of the universe at all. Instead, time is the a priori form of our inner sense. It is the fundamental way that our mind organizes, not just external events, but also our own internal world of thoughts, feelings, and memories. It is the unbreakable, sequential grammar of our own consciousness. Everything we experience, both inside and out, we experience as a succession of moments, one after another. Just as with space, he argues that you cannot possibly imagine any experience, any thought, or any feeling, that does not take place in time. You can, however, imagine time itself, empty of all events, a silent, flowing succession of moments. This proves that time, like space, is not something we learn from the world, but is a fundamental, preloaded structure of our own minds. It is the second great lens in our cognitive glasses, the very framework through which our inner life becomes intelligible to us. This also explains the certainty of another field of knowledge, arithmetic. How do we know, with absolute, a priori certainty, that 7 plus 5 will always and forever equal 12? Kant's answer is that the very process of counting, of adding units together one by one, is an operation that takes place in time. Arithmetic is the formal study of the rules of succession, the logic of our own inner sense of time. Like geometry, it is a science whose certainty is guaranteed, because it is, at its core, a form of structured introspection, a map of the landscape of our own consciousness. The consequences of this idea are profound, dizzying, and deeply humbling. If space and time are the forms of our own intuition, the glasses we can never take off, then this means that the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world, is not in space or in time. These concepts simply do not apply to it. What is a rock really like when it is not extended in space? What is a thought really like when it is not a part of a temporal sequence? These questions, Kant says, are fundamentally meaningless. We can never know, because the very act of knowing something is to place it within the spatio-temporal framework of our own minds. This idea solidifies the great, impenetrable wall between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, the most basic and fundamental features of our reality. The very stage upon which our entire lives unfold are not features of the universe, but are features of the human observer. We are not just characters in the play of life. We are the architects of the very stage on which it is performed. Our minds provide the space for the setting and the timeline for the plot. Our reality is a story that is told in a language of our own making. Kant has now laid the first great pillar of his philosophical system. He has explained the very possibility of what he calls an intuition, the raw, sensible experience of the world. He has shown that our experience is possible because our minds come pre-equipped with a necessary, universal, and unchanging framework, the grid of space and the timeline of, well, time. But this is only the first step, for an experience is not yet knowledge. A raw sensation is not yet a coherent thought. We have the raw data, arranged on the stage of space and time, but what is it that takes this data and turns it into a world of distinct objects, of causes and effects, of a stable, predictable, and understandable reality? This is the work of the second great faculty of the mind, the understanding, and it will be the subject of our next part. Kant has now given us the first great pillar of his system. He has shown that our minds come pre-equipped with a fundamental framework, the forms of space and time that acts as the necessary stage for all possible experience. But a stage is not a play, and a framework is not a picture. Raw experience, even when neatly arranged in space and time, is not yet knowledge. As Kant himself famously said, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. A mind full of raw, unprocessed sensations would be blind, unable to make sense of the chaotic flood of data. To move from raw sensation to coherent understanding, the mind needs a second, more sophisticated set of tools. It needs a way to take the endless stream of appearances and organize it, to sort it, to label it, and to give it a structure that we can actually think about. This is the job of the second great faculty of the mind, the understanding, and its tools are what Kant calls the 12 categories. These are the pure, a priori concepts that our minds use to synthesize and make sense of everything we experience. Imagine the mind is a vast office, and our senses are the mail slot, constantly receiving a flood of letters, postcards, and memos from the outside world. Thanks to the forms of intuition, we know that every piece of mail arrives already stamped with a time and a place, but it is still just a chaotic pile of unsorted paper on the floor. To make any sense of it, we need a filing system. The categories of the understanding are the mind's great filing cabinet, a system of 12 pre-labeled hanging folders, ready and waiting for all incoming data. Every single sensation, every intuition that comes through the mail slot must be sorted and placed into one of these folders. This act of filing is what turns a raw, blind sensation into a structured, intelligible thought. It is the process by which the mind takes the chaotic what of experience and organizes it into a coherent that. This filing system is universal and necessary. We are all born with the same cabinet and the same 12 folders. It is the universal operating system of human reason itself. Kant, with his love for architectural systems, grouped these 12 categories into 4 sets of 3. But we can understand their function by focusing on a few of the most crucial ones. The first and most basic is the category of substance. This is the folder for things. When you look at an apple, you don't actually experience the appleness of it. You experience a collection of separate sensations: redness, roundness, sweetness, a certain texture. It is your mind that takes this scattered bundle of properties and unifies them under the single concept of a substance, an apple. The idea of a stable underlying thing that possesses these properties is not something you receive from the outside world. It is a concept that your own mind contributes to the experience. Without this category, the world would be a meaningless swirl of disconnected colors, tastes, and textures. The category of substance is what allows us to experience a world of stable, recognizable objects, rather than a chaotic sensory soup. It is the mind's way of creating nouns. The next, and perhaps most important category, is that of causality. This is Kant's direct and brilliant answer to the skepticism of David Hume. Hume had argued that we never actually experience cause and effect. Only one event following another. Kant agreed. But he says that the necessary connection is not a fiction of our imagination, it is a fundamental rule of our understanding. Our mind's filing cabinet has a folder labeled cause and effect. And when it receives two events that are constantly conjoined in time, like a flash of lightning followed by a clap of thunder, it automatically files them together under that rule. The law of causality is not a law of the noumenal world, it is a necessary and unbreakable law of the phenomenal world, because it is a fundamental rule of the very mind that constructs that world. This is how Kant saves science. The laws of nature are not just psychological habits, they are objective and universal for all human beings, because we are all using the same cognitive filing system. The world of our experience is, and must be, a world governed by cause and effect. Other categories perform other essential organizing tasks. The categories of unity and plurality allow our minds to take a multitude of sensations and either group them together as a plurality, like many individual trees, or to synthesize them under a single concept of unity, like a forest. This is the very foundation of counting and grouping, the ability to see both the one and the many. Another set of categories, reality and negation, gives us the fundamental ability to make judgments of existence. To say that something is or is not, to distinguish a presence from an absence. But for any of this filing to work, for any of this organization to be possible, there must be a single unified consciousness doing the filing. You cannot have a filing cabinet that is owned by 12 different disconnected people. There must be a single office manager who is aware of all the data and all the folders. This, for Kant, is the I think, or what he calls the transcendental unity of apperception. It is the simple, powerful idea that all of my experiences, all of my thoughts, are my experiences, my thoughts. This unified I is the ultimate foundation of all knowledge, the central thread upon which all the beads of experience are strung. This unified self is the master filer, the consciousness that applies the categories to the raw data of the senses. And this led Kant to one of the most difficult but important arguments in the history of philosophy. The transcendental deduction. His goal was to prove, once and for all, that these categories, these concepts that exist only in our minds, must necessarily and universally apply to all the objects of our experience. His argument, in essence, is that these categories are the very conditions that make experience itself possible. You cannot, he argues, even have a coherent experience of an object. You cannot even recognize a distinct thing in the world unless your mind has already applied its a priori concepts of substance, of causality, of unity, and so on. The categories are not things we discover in the world, they are the very rules that allow us to discover a world in the first place. Therefore, they must apply to all possible human experience, because an experience that did not conform to these rules would not be an experience at all. It would just be a meaningless, chaotic buzz. Kant has now completed the second great pillar of his system. He has reverse-engineered the human understanding itself. We began with the raw, unprocessed data of the senses, a chaotic flood from the unknowable noumenal world. Then, the mind's first set of tools, the forms of intuition, took that data and arranged it on the universal stage of space and time. And now the mind's second set of tools, the categories of the understanding, has taken that spatio-temporal data and filed it, sorted it, and organized it into a coherent, stable, and predictable world of objects and effects. The revolution is nearly complete. Kant has shown that the objective, law-governed world of science is not something we passively discover, but something our own minds actively help to create. He has saved knowledge from the abyss of Hume's skepticism, but he has done so by forever limiting that knowledge to the world of phenomena, to the world of appearances, as structured by our own consciousness. He has given us a firm foundation for our knowledge, but that foundation is built not on the bedrock of ultimate reality, but on the universal and inescapable architecture of the human mind itself. We have now assembled the key components of Kant's revolutionary model of the mind. We have the raw data of the senses, which is then organized on the great stage of space and time, and then filed into a coherent reality by the 12 categories of the understanding. But this intricate and beautiful system was not built for its own sake. It was all constructed to answer one single, powerful, and deeply urgent question, a question that lies at the very heart of his critique of pure reason, and that question is, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? This phrase, synthetic a priori judgments, sounds like a piece of obscure academic jargon, and it is, but it is also the key that unlocks the door to Kant's entire philosophical project. To understand what he means by it is to understand why his Copernican revolution was so necessary and so profound. He believed that this type of judgment was the bedrock of all real knowledge, from the simple truths of arithmetic to the universal laws of physics, and he knew that if he could not explain how it was possible, then all of human knowledge would crumble under the weight of Hume's skepticism. To grasp his meaning, we must first break the phrase down into its component parts. Kant begins by dividing all the statements, or judgments, that we can make into two distinct types: analytic and synthetic. An analytic judgment is a statement that is true simply by definition. The information in the second part of the statement, the predicate, is already contained within the concept of the first part, the subject. The classic example is the statement, all bachelors are unmarried. You don't need to conduct a survey of all bachelors to know this is true. You just need to analyze the definition of the word bachelor. Analytic judgments are truths of clarification. They unpack what we already know, but they don't actually tell us anything new about the world. A synthetic judgment, on the other hand, is a statement that is expansive. It adds new information. The predicate is not contained within the concept of the subject. If I say, the cat is on the mat, the concept of cat does not contain the concept of being on the mat. To know this is true, you have to look, you have to synthesize, or bring together two separate concepts, your knowledge of the cat and your experience of the mat. These judgments tell us new things about the world. Next, Kant makes another, separate distinction between two different ways we can know something: a priori and a posteriori. A priori knowledge is knowledge that is completely independent of experience. It is knowledge that is necessary and universally true. You know, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4. And you know this with absolute certainty, without needing to go out into the world and check. It is a truth of pure reason. A posteriori knowledge, on the other hand, is all knowledge that comes from experience. It is contingent and particular. I know that it is sunny outside, but I only know this a posteriori, by looking out the window, and this fact is not a necessary or universal truth. Now we can put these two distinctions together, and we can see the great philosophical battlefield that Kant inherited. The empiricist, David Hume, had argued that all human knowledge falls into one of two neat categories. You can have analytic, a priori judgment, which are the certain but empty truths of logic and definition. Or you can have synthetic a posteriori judgments, which are the informative but never certain truths of experience. Hume argued that these were the only two options. There was no third category. No way to have knowledge that was both certain and informative about the world. This is where Kant makes his great revolutionary move. He argues that a third, mysterious, and incredibly important category of knowledge not only exists, but is the very foundation of both mathematics and science. This is the category of the synthetic a priori judgment, a statement that is both universally and necessarily true, a priori, and yet also expansive and informative, synthetic. This was the very category that Hume had said was impossible, and the question of how it was possible became the central obsession of Kant's life. His golden example was simple arithmetic. Consider the statement, 7 plus 5 equals 12. Is this statement a priori? Yes, of course. It is a necessary and universal truth. It will be true tomorrow. It will be true on the other side of the universe. You know it through reason, not through experience. But now for the crucial question, is it analytic or synthetic? Hume and the empiricists had assumed it was analytic. Just a definition, but Kant, with a flash of brilliant insight, argued that it is synthetic. Look closely at the concept of 7 plus 5, he says. That concept contains the idea of two numbers and the instruction to combine them, but it does not in itself contain the concept of the number 12. To get to 12, you have to perform an action. You have to actually do the synthesis. You have to count on from 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in doing so, you arrive at a new number, a genuinely new piece of information that was not contained in the original subject. The statement is expansive. It is synthetic, and yet it is also a priori. It is a synthetic, a priori judgment. The same is true, he argues, for the foundational principles of science. Take the statement, every event has a cause. Is this a priori? Kant argues that it must be. For science to be possible, we must assume that this law is universally and necessarily true. But is it synthetic? Yes. The concept of an event, something happening, does not, by its own definition, contain the concept of having a cause. The statement connects two separate ideas and therefore expands our knowledge. It too is a synthetic a priori judgment. So the question becomes, how is this possible? How can we know these necessary and informative truths about the world without deriving them from experience? And now, all the pieces of Kant's great system fall into place. His answer is that synthetic a priori judgments are possible because they are not descriptions of the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. They are descriptions of the necessary structure of the phenomenal world, a world that our own minds help to create. How do we know that 7 plus 5 must always equal 12? Because arithmetic, the process of counting in succession, is built upon the very structure of our a priori form of intuition. We are discovering a necessary truth about the rules of our own consciousness. How do we know that every event must have a cause? Because causality is one of the 12 a priori categories of the understanding. It is a rule in our mind's filing cabinet, and our minds must impose this rule on all the raw sensations we receive in order to make sense of them. We are not discovering the law of causality in the world, we are imposing it upon the world, and because all human minds share this same basic operating system, these laws are objective and universal for all of us. Kant has finally and brilliantly answered his central question. He has shown that certain universal and expansive knowledge of the phenomenal world is possible because our own minds contribute the necessary universal structures that make such knowledge possible. He has saved science and mathematics from the abyss of skepticism. He has completed the core of his Copernican revolution, proving that the objective world of our experience must conform to the a priori laws of our own minds. He has secured the foundations of what we can know, but in doing so, he has also drawn a firm and final line around it, a line that we will soon see has profound implications for the age-old questions of God, freedom, and morality. Immanuel Kant's great critique of pure reason had two profound and equally important goals. The first, which we have just explored, was a positive one: to show how certain, objective knowledge of the world is possible, and in doing so, to save science from the abyss of skepticism. But the second goal was a negative or critical one: to draw a firm and final boundary around the powers of human reason. To show not just what we can know, but also, and more importantly, what we can never ever hope to know. Kant saw that the human mind has a deep, natural, and almost irresistible urge to ask ultimate questions. It is not content to simply understand the chain of cause and effect. It wants to know what the very first cause was. It is not content to map the world of experience. It wants to know what lies beyond that map. What is the nature of the soul? Is there a God? Is the universe finite or infinite? These are the great timeless questions of metaphysics and reason. Kant argues cannot help but ask them. But it is in the very act of asking these ultimate questions that reason falls into a dangerous and seductive trap, a trap he calls the transcendental illusion. This is the illusion that we can take the powerful tools our minds use to organize the world of experience, the categories of the understanding, and apply them to things that lie completely outside of all possible experience, to things in the unknowable noumenal world. It is, Kant says, like trying to see with your ears, or to hear with your eyes. It is a misuse of our cognitive faculties. This illusion is not a simple mistake that can be easily corrected. It is a natural and an unavoidable feature of human reason itself. Kant compares it to an optical illusion, like a stick that appears bent when placed in a glass of water. Even when you know, intellectually, that the stick is straight, you cannot stop your eyes from seeing it as bent. In the same way, even when we know that we cannot have knowledge of ultimate reality, our reason cannot stop itself from trying, from generating illusions about God, the soul, and the cosmos. To prove this, Kant presents his most brilliant and dramatic demonstration of reason's limits, the famous antinomies of pure reason. An antinomedy is a contradiction, a situation where pure reason can be used to prove two opposing and mutually exclusive statements as being equally true. He shows that when reason tries to think about the universe as a whole, a concept that is by definition beyond any possible experience, it inevitably ties itself into these irresolvable knots. Consider the question of whether the universe had a beginning. Kant shows that he can produce a perfectly logical, airtight proof for the thesis that the world must have a beginning in time and be limited in space. He argues that an infinite series of past events is an impossible concept, a completed infinity, and therefore, time must have started somewhere. But then, with equal logical rigor, he produces a proof for the antithesis, that the world has no beginning in time and no limits in space, because the idea of a first moment before which there was nothing but an empty void is equally incomprehensible to reason. So, which is it? Is the universe finite or infinite? Kant's stunning answer is that the question itself is meaningless. The contradiction arises because we are making a fundamental error. We are trying to treat the universe as a whole, as if it were a single, experienceable object, like a table or a chair. But it is not. We are taking the concepts of space and time, which are only the forms of our sensible intuition, and we are trying to apply them to something that transcends all sensibility. It is like asking if the concept of justice is heavy or light. It's a category mistake. He applies this same logic to one of the most enduring problems in all of philosophy, the conflict between freedom and determinism. He first presents a proof for the thesis of scientific determinism, that every event in the world of our experience must have a preceding cause, and that cause must have a cause, and so on, in an unbreakable chain of causality. In this view, there is no room for a free will, but then he presents an equally valid proof for the antithesis, that to explain the world, we must also assume the existence of a free will, a power that can spontaneously begin a new chain of events without being caused by a prior event. Here, his solution is even more ingenious. The contradiction, he says, is resolved by his great distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal worlds. In the phenomenal world, the world of science and appearances, everything is indeed governed by the necessary laws of cause and effect. Determinism is true, but in the noumenal world, the world of the thing in itself, the world of our own inner being, it is at least possible that we are free. We can never know for certain that we have free will, because we can never have knowledge of the noumenal realm, but reason cannot disprove it either. Having shown that reason ties itself in knots when it thinks about the cosmos as a whole, Kant then turns his critical eye to the other great subjects of traditional metaphysics, the immortal soul and God. He argues that all the traditional philosophical proofs for their existence make the same fundamental error. They misuse the categories of the understanding. The idea of an immortal soul, he argues, comes from a logical error he calls a paralogism. We mistake the unified I think that accompanies all our thoughts, which is the condition of experience, for a simple, unified, and enduring object of experience. But we never actually experience a soul substance. We only experience a constantly changing stream of consciousness. Likewise, he systematically dismantles all the traditional arguments for the existence of God. From the ontological argument, to the cosmological argument, to the argument from design, he shows that they all make the same mistake. They take a concept that is only valid within the world of our experience, like existence or cause, and they try to apply it to a being who, by his very definition, must transcend all possible experience. You cannot, Kant insists, use the rules of the phenomenal world to prove the existence of a nominal being. Pure reason is simply the wrong tool for the job. It is crucial to understand that Kant's goal here is not to promote atheism. He was, in fact, a devout man. His goal is to make reason humble, to show that the question of God's existence cannot be settled, one way or the other, by philosophical argument. He wanted to protect the realm of faith from the attacks of a skeptical, scientific reason, and he did this by showing that reason is just as powerless to disprove the existence of God as it is to prove it. These questions are simply beyond its jurisdiction. And so, Kant completes his great critical project. He has secured the foundations of science by limiting its domain to the world of phenomena, and he has, in his own famous words, found it necessary to deny knowledge, in order to make room for faith. By drawing a firm and final boundary around what we can know, he has carved out a safe and protected space for the great unanswerable questions that give human life its ultimate meaning, the questions of God, of freedom, and of morality. These things cannot be known, but as we will see, Kant believes they must be thought, they must be believed, and they must be acted upon. And this is the task of his second great critique, the critique of our practical reason. Having charted the limits of what human reason can know, Kant now turns to the question that haunted him even more deeply, the question of what we ought to do. He has shown that we can never have theoretical scientific knowledge of God, freedom, or the soul, and therefore morality cannot be based on any theological command or metaphysical fact. He has also, by showing the limits of experience, rejected any attempt to base morality on simple consequences or the pursuit of happiness. A new and unshakable foundation was needed, and Kant believed he had found it not in the stars above, but in the reason within. His great ethical work, the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, opens with one of the most famous and powerful sentences in the history of philosophy. "Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world," he writes, "or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will." This is the absolute and unshakable starting point for his entire ethical system, the single fixed point in the moral universe, the only thing whose goodness does not depend on anything else. To understand why this is so radical, we must understand what Kant is rejecting. He asks us to consider all the other things we typically call good, talents of the mind, like intelligence, wit, and judgment, are surely good, but they can be used for the most evil of purposes by a brilliant villain. Qualities of character, like courage, resolution, and perseverance, are also good, but the courage of a terrorist or the perseverance of an assassin only makes them more terrible and more dangerous. Their virtues are in the service of a bad will. Even the traditional gifts of fortune, things like power, wealth, health, and even happiness itself, are not good without qualification. Power can corrupt, wealth can lead to arrogance, and good health can allow a brute to carry out his wicked plans more effectively. Even happiness, the ultimate goal of so many other ethical systems, is not good in itself, for as Kant points out, the sight of a despicable villain living a happy, prosperous, and untroubled life is something that strikes any impartial spectator as morally offensive. His happiness is undeserved. Only the good will, Kant concludes, is good in and of itself. Its value is not determined by the results it produces or the consequences it achieves. A good will that, through some misfortune, is completely unable to accomplish its goals is still just as morally worthy as one that succeeds. Its goodness is not in what it does, but in what it is. It is like a jewel, he says, that shines by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Kant has radically shifted the focus of morality, away from the external world of consequences and onto the internal world of motive. So what, then, is a good will? What does it mean to have a purely good motive? Kant's answer is precise and demanding. A good will is a will that acts purely from duty, and to understand this, he makes another of his crucial distinctions, the distinction between acting from duty and acting merely in accordance with duty. To illustrate this, he gives us the famous example of a simple shopkeeper, a man whose job it is to give his customers the correct change. Imagine an inexperienced child comes into his shop. The shopkeeper could easily overcharge the child and get away with it. This action would be contrary to duty and is obviously immoral, but now imagine the shopkeeper gives the child the correct change. But he does so only because he knows that if word gets out that he cheats his customers, his business will suffer in the long run. In this case, his action is in accordance with duty. He has done the right thing. But his action has no true moral worth, because his motive was not duty itself, but a selfish calculation of his own advantage. Let's take a third case. Imagine the shopkeeper gives the correct change simply because he is a naturally kind and sympathetic man. He likes his customers, and he gets a warm philanthropic feeling from being honest. Again, his action is correct. It is in accordance with duty, and we should certainly praise it. But Kant, in his strictness, argues that it still has no true, unadulterated moral worth, for it is based on a mere feeling, an inclination, and feelings are fickle, unreliable, and accidental. What if, on another day, the shopkeeper is in a bad mood? Will he still be honest then? Finally, consider a fourth shopkeeper. Imagine this man is by nature a miserable curmudgeon. His life has been filled with sorrow, and he has lost all sympathy for his fellow human beings. He hates his job, he hates his customers, and he is deeply tempted to cheat them just to spite the world, but despite his own feelings, despite his own inclinations, he gives the correct change anyway. He does this for one reason, and one reason only, because he recognizes that it is his duty to be honest. This action, and this action alone, Kant says, has true moral worth. To act from duty, then, is to act out of pure respect for the moral law. It is to perform an action not because you desire to, not because it makes you feel good, and not because it produces a good outcome, but simply and solely because your own reason recognizes it as the right thing to do. It is an act of will that has successfully triumphed over all your own selfish desires, your fleeting emotions, and your calculations of personal advantage. It is an act of pure rational and Kantian principle. Kant has now cleared the ground for his entire ethical system. He has located the source of all moral value in the inner sanctum of the human will. He has shown that the goodness of an action is determined not by its results, but by its motive, and that the only truly good motive is the motive of duty, a pure and unconditional respect for the moral law. He has stripped morality of all its external and emotional supports, leaving it standing on the single powerful and unshakable pillar of rational self-determination. But this immediately raises the next great and most important question. What is this moral law if we are to act out of respect for it? We must be able to know what it is. What is this universal, necessary, and unconditional principle that our own reason is supposed to give to us? This law, which must be valid for all rational beings, at all times, in all places, is what Kant will call the categorical imperative. And it will be the subject of our next part. It is the formula that will tell us once and for all what our duty is. We have arrived at the very heart of Immanuel Kant's ethical system. We know that for him, the only truly good thing is a good will, and a good will is one that acts purely from duty, out of respect for the moral law. But what is this law if it's not based on God's commands or the pursuit of happiness, or our own fickle feelings? Where does it come from, and what does it command us to do? Kant's answer is one of the most famous, most powerful, and most challenging ideas in the history of thought: the categorical imperative. To understand what's so special about this imperative, we must first distinguish it from the thousands of other imperatives, or commands, that our reason gives us every day. Most of the commands we follow are what Kant calls hypothetical imperatives. They are conditional. They take the form of, if you want X, then you must do Y. For example, if you want to be a good chess player, then you must study the great masters. Or, if you want to avoid a hangover, then you must not drink too much. These are commands of skill or prudence, but they are not commands of morality. A moral law, Kant argues, cannot be hypothetical. It cannot depend on what you happen to want. It must be categorical, which means it must be absolute, unconditional, and universally binding on all rational beings, regardless of their personal desires or goals. It does not say, if you want to be a good person, then you should not lie. It simply and absolutely commands, do not lie. It is a law that reason issues with the full force of its own authority. a command that admits no exceptions. So what is this one, supreme, unconditional law? Kant gives it several different formulations, but the first and most famous is this: act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law of nature. This is the great test, the objective, rational procedure for determining whether any action is morally permissible, and to understand it, we must first understand its key term, a maxim. A maxim is simply a personal rule or principle that you are acting upon. It is the subjective reason for your action. The test, then, is to take your personal subjective maxim and to universalize it. You must imagine a world where everyone, always, by a law of nature as unbreakable as gravity, is compelled to act on the same principle you are about to use. The crucial question is not, would I like to live in such a world, but the much stricter, logical question, could such a world even exist without contradicting itself? If your maxim, when universalized, creates a logical or practical contradiction, then the action is morally forbidden. If it doesn't, it is permissible. To show how this test works in practice, Kant gives us his most famous and powerful example: the case of the lying promise. Imagine you are in a desperate financial situation, and you know that the only way to get a loan is to promise to pay it back, even though you have absolutely no intention of ever doing so. Your personal maxim would be, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I will wallow it and promise to repay it, even though I know I never can. Now we must apply the test. We must universalize it. Imagine a world where everyone, by a law of nature, makes false promises whenever they are in need. What would happen in such a world? Very quickly, the entire institution of promising would collapse. No one would believe any promise that anyone ever made, because the universal law would be that all promises made in need are lies, and if no one believes in promises, then it becomes impossible to make a promise in the first place. The very act becomes meaningless. Your maxim, when universalized, has destroyed the very possibility of its own existence. It is a self-contradiction. Therefore, Kant concludes, making a lying promise is not just bad, it is fundamentally irrational, and thus, he applies this same logic to another difficult case, the question of taking one's own life to escape a painful existence. The maxim here would be, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when its continuation is likely to bring more pain than satisfaction. Now, we must universalize this. Imagine a world where the natural instinct of self-love, whose very purpose is to preserve and enhance life, is used as a universal principle to destroy life. Kant argues that this is a fundamental contradiction in the system of nature. You cannot, he says, rationally will that a single principle should work to both preserve and destroy life at the same time. The maxim again fails the test of universalization. He then gives an example of a different kind of contradiction, a contradiction in the will. Consider the maxim of a person who decides to neglect their natural talents in favor of a life of pure leisure and amusement. I will not bother to cultivate my gifts and will instead devote my life to idle pleasures. Can we imagine a world where everyone by a law of nature follows this maxim? Yes, Kant says, such a world could exist without a logical contradiction. A world of lazy but harmless beachcombers is not an impossible concept. But he argues, you could not rationally will for such a world to exist. As a rational being, you necessarily and instinctively will that your own faculties and talents should be developed. To will that everyone should let their talents rust is to will against your own rational nature. Your will would be in a state of contradiction with itself, therefore neglecting your talents is a moral failing. It is a violation of a duty to yourself. It is not a perfect duty, like telling the truth, but it is an imperfect duty, a general obligation to strive for self-improvement. His final example concerns our duty to others. Consider the maxim of a prosperous man who decides he will not help anyone in need. Let everyone be as happy as heaven pleases, or as he can make himself. He says, I will not take anything from him or even envy him, but I have no desire to contribute to his welfare or to assist him in his distress. Again, we must universalize this. Could a world exist where no one ever helps anyone else? Yes, a world of rugged, isolated individuals is logically possible. But Kant argues you could not rationally will for this to be a universal law, because you know that you yourself are a finite and vulnerable being, and that you will inevitably, at some point in your life, find yourself in a situation where you need the help of others. If you had willed a universal law of non-assistance, you would be depriving yourself of the very aid you would then desire. Your will would again be in contradiction with itself. Therefore we have an imperfect duty to help others, a duty of benevolence. Kant believes he has now given us a formal, objective, and purely rational procedure for determining our moral duties. He has created a system of ethics that is not based on the shifting sands of emotion, the commands of an external authority, or the uncertain calculations of consequences. It is based on the single powerful and universal principle of non-contradiction. An immoral action, for Kant, is not just a bad action, it is a fundamentally irrational one. It is an action whose personal principle cannot be elevated to a universal law without destroying itself. It is a quiet, logical rebellion against the very structure of reason itself. We have seen how Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative provides a powerful, logical test for our moral duties, a way to determine if our personal principles can be willed as a universal law. But Kant was aware that this formulation, in all its rational purity, could feel cold, abstract, and distant from the lived human experience of morality. It tells us about the form of the moral law, but it doesn't tell us much about its substance. What is it in the world that has such absolute, unconditional value that it can be the source of such a law? And so, Kant offers a second formulation, a different way of expressing the very same supreme principle of morality, but one that is grounded not in pure logic, but in the concept of intrinsic worth. It is a formulation that has echoed through the centuries and has become the very bedrock of our modern conception of human rights and dignity. This is the humanity formula, and it commands us, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. To understand this powerful command, we must first understand what Kant means by treating someone as a means to an end. In our daily lives, we use people as means all the time. When I buy bread from a baker, I am using the baker as a means to satisfy my hunger. When I take a taxi, I am using the driver as a means to get to my destination. For Kant, there is nothing immoral about this in itself. It is a simple and necessary feature of human society. The crucial and morally decisive word in his formula is merely. It is immoral to treat a person merely as a means, as if they were nothing more than a tool to be used for your own purposes, a simple object to be manipulated to achieve your goals. When I pay the baker for the bread, I am respecting him as a person, as a rational agent with his own goals and his own life. Our transaction is a consensual one, but if I were to steal the bread, or to trick him with counterfeit money, I would then be using him merely as a means. I would be disregarding his own rational will and treating him as a simple obstacle or a tool. To treat a person as an end in itself, on the other hand, is the positive command of this law. It is to recognize that every rational being, every person, has an absolute and intrinsic worth. Their value is not based on how useful they are to me, or how much I happen to like them. Their value comes from the simple, profound fact that they are a person, a free, rational agent, capable of setting their own goals and making their own choices. To treat a person as an end is to respect their humanity, to acknowledge that their life, their project, and their goals are just as real and just as important as my own. To show the power of this new formulation, Kant revisits his four original examples, and we see how this principle leads to the very same conclusions as the universal law. Consider the lying promise. When I make a false promise to a man to get his money, I am using him merely as a means to my own financial gain. I am deceiving him, and in doing so, I am denying his ability to make a free, rational choice. If he knew the truth, he would not consent to the loan. I have, therefore, failed to treat him as an end in himself, treating him instead as a walking wallet, an object to be manipulated. Now consider the duty to oneself, the case of a person ending their own life to escape suffering. In this tragic act, Kant argues, the person is using their own humanity, their own rational nature, merely as a means to an end. The end is the relief of pain, and their own personhood is the tool they are using to achieve it. They are failing to respect the absolute, intrinsic worth of their own rational being. A worth that, for Kant, is not something that can be discarded, even in the face of immense suffering. This shows that we have duties, not just to others, but to the humanity that exists within our own person. The same is true for the duty to cultivate one's talents. If I choose to let my natural gifts and abilities rust away in favor of a life of simple pleasure and amusement, I am failing to treat my own humanity as an end in itself. A rational being's purpose, Kant believes, is to develop and perfect its own rational capacities. To simply let them wither is to treat my own person as a mere means to the end of a comfortable and easy life. It is a failure to live up to the full potential of my own rational nature. And finally, consider the duty of benevolence. The duty to help others. If I refuse to help someone who is in dire need, a person whose own projects and goals are in danger of failing, I am failing to treat them as an end in themselves. I may not be actively using them as a means, but I am failing to positively affirm and support their status as a rational being with their own life to live. To truly respect humanity as an end is not just a negative duty to avoid harming others, it is also a positive, if imperfect, duty to actively help them flourish. This formulation reveals the foundation of what Kant calls dignity in the world, he says. Everything has either a price or a dignity. A thing that has a price can be replaced by something else of equivalent value. I can trade one chair for another chair of equal quality, or I can trade a certain amount of work for a certain amount of money, but a person, a rational being, does not have a price. You cannot trade one person for another. Their worth is not relative or conditional. It is absolute, intrinsic, and above all price. This worth is what Kant calls dignity. And this, finally, reveals the ultimate source of the moral law's authority. Why must we obey the categorical imperative? We must obey it because it is the only law that is consistent with the supreme value of our own being. The moral law is not a command that is imposed upon us from the outside, by God or by society. It is a law that arises from, and is an expression of, the very thing that makes us who we are. Our own rational and free nature. To act immorally is to disrespect the very source of all value in the universe. The dignity of the rational being. We are not just subjects of the moral law, we are, in a very profound sense, its authors. Our own reason gives us the law, and in obeying it, we are not submitting to an alien power, we are simply being true to our deepest and most essential selves. We are affirming our own status as free, dignified, and self-legislating beings, and this powerful idea, that every one of us is both a citizen and a king in the moral universe, leads directly to Kant's final, inspiring vision of a perfect ethical society, a society he calls the kingdom of ends. We have journeyed into the heart of Kant's moral system and found two powerful formulations of a single supreme law. The first, the universal law, gave us the pure, logical form of a moral action, a test of rational consistency. The second, the humanity formula, gave us the matter or content of morality, the absolute intrinsic value of the rational being. Now, Kant brings these two ideas together to present his third, final, and most inspiring vision of the moral life. A vision that is not just about individual action, but about a perfect moral community, an ideal he calls the kingdom of ends. This concept is the final and most complete formulation of the categorical imperative, a command to act in accordance with the maxims of a member, giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. It's a complex and beautiful phrase, and to understand it, we must first understand what Kant means by a kingdom. For him, a kingdom is simply a systematic union of different rational beings who are all united under a set of common laws. In our everyday lives, we are all members of various kingdoms. A family, a city, a profession, a nation, each with its own rules and principles. But the kingdom of ends is a special, ideal, and purely moral kingdom. Its citizens are not just any beings, they are ends in themselves. A concept we explored in our last part. They are rational agents who possess an absolute, unconditional worth, a dignity that is beyond all price. This kingdom, then, is a community composed entirely of beings who are valued not for their usefulness, not for their social status, and not for their wealth, but simply and profoundly for the fact that they are persons. They are the very source of all moral value in the universe. This is where Kant introduces his most brilliant and deeply democratic insight. In this ideal moral kingdom, every single member has two distinct and simultaneous roles. They are both a member and a sovereign. As a member, or a citizen, of this kingdom, each person is subject to the universal moral laws. They are bound to obey the categorical imperative in all their actions. But, and this is the revolutionary move, as a rational being, each person is also the author of those very same laws. They are the sovereign, the head of state, the legislator. The moral law is not a set of rules that is imposed upon us from the outside, by a king, by a society, or even by a god. It is a law that our own reason gives to itself. We are the authors of the very commands that we are bound to obey. This is the very essence of what Kant calls autonomy or self-legislation. To be truly free, for Kant, is not to live without laws. It is to live by the laws that you yourself have rationally created and endorsed. In the kingdom of ends, every single citizen is also the king. Every subject is also the sovereign. It is a perfect rational democracy of the soul. This vision allows us to imagine what a truly and perfectly moral society would look like. It would be a community founded on a principle of absolute and universal mutual respect. Every person would treat every other person as a fellow legislator, a fellow sovereign, a being of infinite worth. No one would be used merely as a tool. No one would be deceived or coerced, because to do so would be to disrespect their status as a free and rational author of the moral law. All interactions would be based on the free, rational consent of all parties. This is not necessarily a world without disagreement or conflict, but it is a world where all conflicts would be resolved through the public use of reason, through a process of mutual respect for the dignity of the other person. It is a community where the private good of the individual and the common good of the whole are no longer in conflict, but are seen as two sides of the same coin. For in acting morally, in acting for the good of the kingdom, you are simply being true to your own rational nature, the very nature that you share with every other member. Kant, however, is not a naive utopian. He knows that this perfect kingdom of ends is not a place that we can ever hope to build in its perfect form here on earth. Our world is, and always will be, a messy, imperfect place, a kingdom of means, where people are too often driven by their selfish inclinations, by their desires for power, and by their irrational impulses. The kingdom of ends is not a political blueprint. It is a moral ideal, a regulative principle. It is the North Star of our moral lives. Our duty, then, is to always act as if we were a legislating member of this perfect moral community. We must, in our own lives, strive to make the real, phenomenal world more closely resemble this ideal kingdom. Every time we choose to tell the truth, when a lie would be easier. Every time we treat another person with respect and dignity. Every time we act from a sense of pure duty, we are bringing a small piece of the kingdom of ends into being here on earth. We are casting a vote for a world governed by reason and mutual respect. This final formulation brilliantly synthesizes the previous two. When we act on a personal maxim that we can rationally will to be a universal law, as the first formulation demanded, we are acting in our capacity as a sovereign, a universal legislator for the entire kingdom. And when we treat all of humanity, in ourselves and in others, always as an end and never merely as a means, as the second formulation demanded, we are acting in our capacity as a loyal member, respecting the absolute dignity of every other citizen of that same kingdom. The kingdom of ends is the ultimate social and political expression of the categorical imperative. It takes a rule for individual conduct and expands it into a luminous and inspiring vision for all of humanity. It is a vision of a world where the freedom of the individual and the harmony of the community are not opposing forces, but are instead perfectly and beautifully reconciled. A world where we are all free, precisely because we are all bound by the same universal law that our own shared reason has created. Kant has now completed his positive vision of the moral world, a world grounded not in the shifting sands of experience, but in the unshakable, a priori foundations of pure reason itself. He has given us a law, a source of value, and an ideal community, but a profound and difficult question still remains. How can we reconcile this vision of a free, autonomous, and self-legislating moral agent with the world of science, a world where every event, including our own actions, seems to be determined by an unbreakable chain of cause and effect? This is the great problem of freedom, and it will be the subject of our next part. We have now constructed the magnificent edifice of Kant's moral world, a kingdom of ends, populated by free, rational beings who legislate the moral law for themselves, a world grounded in the absolute dignity of the human person. But a profound and terrifying crack runs through the very foundation of this beautiful structure, a deep philosophical contradiction that threatens to bring the entire system crashing down into a pile of beautiful but meaningless ruins. This is the great and seemingly irresolvable conflict between freedom and determinism. Kant's own first critique, the critique of pure reason, has masterfully proven that the world of our experience, the phenomenal world, is a world governed by unbreakable laws of nature. Every event, from a star exploding to a neuron firing in the human brain, is part of an endless and unbreakable chain of causality. Everything that happens is necessarily determined by what came before it. This is the world of science, a world without miracles, a world without uncaused causes, and our own actions, as physical events in this world, must be a part of this chain. But Kant's entire moral philosophy is built on the absolute necessity of freedom. For the concepts of duty, of responsibility, of a good will, to have any meaning at all, we must be the true and free authors of our own choices. If our actions are just the predetermined results of a long chain of prior causes, our genetics, our upbringing, our brain chemistry, then it makes no sense to praise someone for their virtue or to blame them for their vice. You might as well praise a river for flowing downhill or blame a stone for falling. Morality itself seems to become an illusion. This is the great antinomy, the profound contradiction that Kant must now resolve. On the one hand, reason tells us that we live in a deterministic universe of cause and effect. On the other hand, reason tells us that for morality to be possible, we must be free. It seems that science and morality are locked in a fight to the death, and that one of them must be a grand illusion. Kant's solution to this problem is perhaps the most ingenious, most difficult, and most important move in his entire philosophical system, a solution that depends entirely on the great distinction he had already made, the distinction between the phenomenal and the nominal worlds. He asks us to consider that we exist in two different ways, from two different standpoints, simultaneously. From one standpoint, as an object of experience in the world, as a physical body that can be studied by science, my phenomenal self is completely and totally determined by the laws of causality. A neuroscientist in theory could map every single cause and effect chain in my brain and predict my every action. From this perspective, I am not free. I am a complex and sophisticated biological machine, a part of nature. But I am not only a phenomenon, I am also a thing in itself, a nominal being, my true inner, rational self. My consciousness is not something that exists in the world of space, time, and causality. It is the very condition that makes that world possible. And this nominal self, Kant argues, is not subject to the laws of causality because causality is a category that only applies to the world of appearances, to the phenomenal world. It is therefore at least logically possible that this nominal self is free. Think of it like a character in a video game. From the perspective of someone inside the game, the character's every action is perfectly predictable. It is determined by the game's computer code, the laws of its digital physics. But we, the players, exist outside the game, outside its code, and we are the ones who are freely choosing the character's actions with our controller. Kant is arguing that we are, in a profound sense, both the character and the player. We are both a determined object in the world of nature and a free subject in the world of morality. This distinction allows Kant to define true freedom in a new and powerful way. He distinguishes between heteronomy and autonomy. When my actions are determined by something other than my own pure reason, when I act because of my desires, my fears, my emotions, or even because of the commands of a king or a god, my will is in a state of heteronomy. Meaning other law, my will is not free, it is being caused by an external or internal inclination. It is a part of the great causal chain of the phenomenal world. True freedom, Kant insists, is autonomy, or self-law. My will is only truly and completely free when it gives the law to itself, when it chooses to act according to a principle that arises from its own rational nature. And what is this principle? It is, of course, the categorical imperative. When I choose to act from duty, out of pure respect for the moral law that my own reason provides, I am performing an act of pure autonomy. It is an act of the nominal self. An uncaused cause, breaking into the determined chain of the phenomenal world. So, is an action free or is it determined? Kant's answer is that it is both. It simply depends on the standpoint from which you are viewing it. The very same act can be described in two different but completely non-contradictory ways. A scientist can look at my act of telling the truth and explain it as a determined phenomenal event, a result of my upbringing, my brain chemistry, and the social situation I am in, and that explanation would be perfectly valid. But a moral philosopher, or indeed I myself, can look at that very same act from a different standpoint and see it as a free, autonomous choice, an act of the noumenal self choosing to align its will with the moral law, for which I am fully responsible. Science describes the world of what is, while morality describes the world of what ought to be, and because they are two different standpoints, two different language games, they can coexist without contradiction. It is crucial to understand that we can never prove that we are free. Freedom, if it exists, is a property of the noumenal self, and we can have no theoretical knowledge of the noumenal world. We cannot see the player holding the controller. We can only experience the character moving on the screen. Freedom, for Kant, is not a fact of science. It is a necessary postulate of our practical, moral lives. We don't know that we are free, but we must act as if we are, in order to make sense of our own experience as moral beings. This is the great burden and the great glory of the human condition in Kant's eyes. We are citizens of two worlds. We are at once a part of the determined world of nature, a creature of flesh and blood, subject to its unbreakable laws, and at the same time, we are members of the free world of morality, a kingdom of rational beings, capable of giving the law to ourselves. We are the strange, paradoxical point where the world of what is and the world of what ought to be intersect. This freedom is the keystone, he says, of his entire moral system, the one idea upon which everything else depends. Having now secured it, he can turn his attention to the other great ideas that our moral lives seem to require. God and the immortality of the soul. We have followed Immanuel Kant on a profound and difficult journey. He has torn down the old metaphysics, showing that our theoretical reason can never have knowledge of the great, ultimate questions of God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul. He then rebuilt his entire system on a new foundation, the foundation of our practical, moral reason. And he showed that we must, at the very least, assume that we are free in order to make sense of our lives as moral agents. But what of the other two great ideas, God and the soul? Having been expelled from the house of knowledge, do they have any place at all in Kant's rational universe? The answer is yes, but they do not re-enter through the front door of theoretical proof. They come in quietly, through the side door of our moral lives. Kant is not going to offer us a new argument to prove that God and the soul exist. Instead, he will argue that we have a purely rational basis for believing that they exist. He introduces them not as objects of knowledge, but as necessary postulates of practical reason. A postulate is something that cannot be proven, but that must be assumed to be true in order for a particular activity, in this case, the moral life, to be fully rational and coherent. To understand why our moral reason needs these postulates, we must first understand what Kant believes is the ultimate goal of all our moral striving. Our reason, he says, is not content just to follow the moral law. It naturally seeks a state of perfect moral completion, a world where everything is as it ought to be. This ultimate ideal state he calls the highest good, or the summum bonum. This highest good is the one complete object of our moral will, the world that we are all, by our very nature as rational beings, commanded to try and bring into existence. What does this perfect world, this highest good, consist of? Kant argues that it has two essential components. The first, and most important, is perfect virtue. This is a world where every single rational being acts as a perfect legislator in the kingdom of ends, a world where everyone's will is in perfect, unwavering alignment with the moral law. This is the supreme condition of the highest good, the part that we can and must work towards through our own dutiful actions. It is the pursuit of a holy will. But there is a second, necessary component, and that is perfect happiness. The highest good is not a world of virtuous but miserable people. It is a world where happiness is distributed in exact and perfect proportion to moral worthiness. A world where the virtuous are happy and the wicked are not. Reason demands this perfect synthesis of virtue and happiness. For a world where good people suffer and villains prosper, is a world that seems fundamentally and irrationally unjust. The highest good requires a perfect harmony between the moral law and the law of our own well-being. And it is in our duty to pursue this highest good that the great problems arise, problems that force our reason to make its postulates. First, consider the goal of achieving a perfect, holy will, a will that is completely free from the temptations of our desires and inclinations. Kant argues that this is a task of infinite difficulty. It is not something that a finite, flawed, and mortal being like a human can ever hope to achieve in the short span of an earthly life. Our progress towards moral perfection is an endless striving, a journey that never fully reaches its destination. And yet, the moral law commands us to strive for this perfect holiness. It is our absolute duty, and Kant holds to the powerful principle that ought implies can. If the moral law commands us to do something, it must be possible for us to do it. Therefore, if we are commanded to undertake an infinite task, reason must assume that we have an infinite amount of time in which to complete it. And so, we arrive at the first great postulate of practical reason. We must postulate the immortality of the soul. We cannot prove that the soul is immortal, but our moral life only makes rational sense if we assume that our existence continues beyond the grave, allowing for an endless progress towards the moral perfection that our duty commands. The immortality of the soul is, for Kant, a necessary hope, a rational faith, that our moral journey does not end with the death of our physical body. It is the postulate that makes sense of our duty to become perfect. Now consider the second component of the highest good, the perfect harmony of virtue and happiness. As we look around the phenomenal world, the world of our experience, we see absolutely no evidence of such a harmony. The causal laws of nature are completely and totally indifferent to the moral worth of individuals. A good person can be struck by lightning just as easily as a wicked one. A virtuous farmer can see his crops fail, while a greedy speculator becomes fabulously wealthy. In the world of nature, there is no necessary connection whatsoever between being good and being happy. And yet our duty commands us to strive for a world where this connection is necessary, a world where virtue is proportionally rewarded with happiness. But how can we possibly bring this about? We are not the authors of the laws of nature. We cannot guarantee that our own virtue, or the virtue of others, will lead to happiness. For this harmony to be possible, there must be a cause, a supreme ultimate power, that is the author of both the moral law and the natural law, a being that can ensure that, in the grand scheme of things, the two are brought into a perfect, just alignment. This leads directly to Kant's second great postulate. We must postulate the existence of God. God is the necessary condition for the possibility of the highest good. He is the supreme, rational, and moral will, who is the author of nature, and who can therefore guarantee that a world governed by moral laws is also a world where happiness is ultimately proportioned to that morality. We must believe in God, not to explain the existence of the universe, but to make rational sense of our own moral striving. God is the postulate that makes sense of our hope for justice. It is absolutely crucial to understand what Kant is and is not doing here. He is not in any way offering a new proof for the existence of God, or the immortality of the soul. He has already, in his first critique, demolished all such theoretical proofs. This is a moral argument. It does not provide us with objective theoretical knowledge, which he called Wissen. It provides us instead with a rational, moral basis for faith, which he called Glaube. It is a faith grounded not in superstition, not in scripture, and not in metaphysical speculation, but in the very demands of our own practical reason. And now we can finally understand the full meaning of Kant's most famous and most profound statement, that he had found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. The first critique denied knowledge. It cleared away the rubble of the old, flawed, dogmatic proofs for God, showing that our theoretical reason can never reach that far. And the second critique makes room for a new kind of faith, a rational faith, a moral faith, a belief that is grounded in the very structure of our lives as free and dutiful beings. Kant has, in his own view, completed his great project. He has placed science and morality on their own, separate and unshakable foundations. He has shown that we are at once citizens of a determined, natural world that we can know, and of a free, moral world that we must believe in. He has given reason its limits, but in doing so, he has also given it a new and more profound dignity. as the source of a moral law that leads us inevitably to a rational hope in a just and meaningful universe. Immanuel Kant did not construct his great ethical system in a vacuum. He was keenly aware of the long history of moral philosophy, and his work was a direct and revolutionary response to the traditions that had come before him. To truly grasp the radical and uncompromising nature of his vision, we must now place him in the great arena of ideas and see how his philosophy stands in contrast to its two major rivals. For in the history of Western thought, there have been three great families of answers to the question, how should I live? The first, and the one we have just explored, is Kant's own deontology. This is a system that focuses on the action itself, on the inherent rightness or wrongness of our deeds. Its central concern is with rules, duties, and most importantly, the inner motive of the moral agent. For a deontologist like Kant, an action is good only if it is performed from a good will, out of a pure sense of duty and respect for a universal moral law. The consequences of the action, whether they are good or bad, are morally irrelevant. But for the second great school of thought, the consequences are the only thing that matters. This is consequentialism, and its most famous and influential form is utilitarianism, championed by British philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill for the utilitarian. The question of motive is a distraction, and the idea of an action being inherently wrong is meaningless. There is only one simple and powerful measure of morality, the greatest happiness principle. This principle states that the morally right action, in any given situation, is the one that produces the greatest amount of good, or happiness, for the greatest number of people. It is a kind of moral arithmetic. You must weigh the potential pleasures and pains that your action will cause, and choose the course that maximizes the overall good. It is a practical, forward-looking, and deeply intuitive system. One that seems to capture the common-sense idea that morality should be about making the world a better, happier place. To see the profound difference between these two systems, we can use a famous thought experiment, the trolley problem. Imagine a runaway trolley is about to strike and end the lives of 5 people who are tied to the main track. You are standing by a lever and you can pull this lever to divert the trolley onto a sidetrack. But there is one person tied to the sidetrack. You have 2 choices: do nothing, and the 5 people will perish, or pull the lever, and the 1 person will perish. What is the right thing to do? For a utilitarian, the answer is relatively simple, though tragic. You should pull the lever. The consequences are clear. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 results in the greatest good for the greatest number. It is a terrible choice, but from a purely consequentialist standpoint, it is the morally correct one. The motive is irrelevant. Only the final tally of lives saved and lost matters, but for a Kantian, the problem is a nightmare of contradiction and moral paralysis. The first formulation of the categorical imperative, the universal law, doesn't seem to give a clear answer, but the second formulation, the humanity formula, is a massive obstacle. It commands us to treat all persons never merely as a means, but always as an end in themselves. If you pull the lever, you are actively choosing to end the life of the person on the sidetrack. You are using that individual merely as a means to the end of saving the other 5. You are sacrificing their absolute, intrinsic worth for the sake of a greater good, and for a strict Kantian, this is something that is categorically, unconditionally forbidden. For Kant, there are some actions, like lying, or ending an innocent life, that are absolutely wrong. Regardless of the good consequences they might produce, you cannot use one person's dignity as a stepping stone to the happiness of others. His system is one of absolute duties and inviolable rights, not of flexible calculations. He would argue that utilitarianism, by focusing on external consequences and the fleeting feeling of happiness, is a form of heteronomy. It makes morality dependent on the unpredictable outcomes of the world, not on the pure rational and autonomous will within. The third great rival to Kant's system is a much older tradition, one that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. This is virtue ethics, and its greatest proponent was Aristotle. The virtue ethicist is not primarily concerned with rules or consequences. They ask a fundamentally different question, not what is the right thing to do, but what kind of person should I be? Morality, for them, is not about following a universal law or calculating happiness. It is about cultivating a virtuous character. A moral action is simply the kind of action that a virtuous person would perform in a given situation. The goal of the moral life is to develop the virtues, qualities like courage, temperance, generosity, and justice. Aristotle famously described virtue as a golden mean, a balance between two extremes. Courage, for example, is the golden mean between the vice of cowardice and the vice of recklessness. Morality is a skill, a kind of practical wisdom that a person develops over a lifetime of practice, until being good becomes a natural and ingrained part of who they are. To understand the difference, imagine a person who donates a large sum of money to charity. The utilitarian would look at the action and say, "This is good, because it produced a great deal of happiness for many people." The motive is irrelevant. The Kantian would look at the action and ask, what was the motive? Did they donate out of a pure sense of duty, or because they wanted a tax break and public praise? Only if the motive was pure duty does the act have moral worth. But the virtue ethicist would look at the action and say, this is the act of a generous and compassionate person. This action demonstrates a virtuous character. Kant, while admiring the virtues, found this approach to be too vague and unreliable. How do we know, with certainty, what a virtuous person would do in a complex moral dilemma? It relies on social context, on habit, on a kind of fuzzy intuition. It does not, in his view, provide a clear, rational, and universal principle like the categorical imperative, which can give us a definitive answer in any situation. For Kant, morality must be grounded in the certainty of reason, not the contingencies of character. And so, we see the radical and uncompromising nature of Kant's position. In a world of complex moral calculations and nuanced character studies, he offers a vision of morality that is as clear, as absolute, and as universal as the laws of logic. He places the source of moral worth not in the uncertain future of consequences, and not in the cultivated habits of character, but in the one thing we can be absolutely certain of, the motive of our own rational will. His deontology remains a powerful and enduring testament to the idea of a morality grounded not in what we get or what we are, but in the simple, profound, and unshakable call of duty. Having constructed his two great philosophical systems, the world of deterministic nature on one side and the world of moral freedom on the other, Kant was left with a profound problem. He had created a universe that was split in two, a great, seemingly unbridgeable chasm between the cold, causal laws of science and the noble free commands of morality. His final great work, The Critique of Judgment, is his attempt to build a bridge across this chasm, to find a way to make our experience of the world feel whole again, and he finds the materials for this bridge in a very very mysterious, and often overlooked place: our feelings of beauty and purpose. He begins by asking a question that seems at first much simpler than his earlier inquiries: what happens in our minds when we look at a flower, or a sunset, or a beautiful piece of music and declare that it is beautiful? He's not interested in our personal preferences, in whether you happen to like the color blue, or I happen to like the sound of a violin. He is interested in a specific and powerful kind of judgment, the judgment of taste. The claim that something is truly beautiful, a claim he believes is both deeply personal and strangely universal. The first and most crucial feature of this judgment is that the pleasure we take in the beautiful must be completely disinterested. This is a radical and counterintuitive idea. To judge something as beautiful, our pleasure in it must be free from any personal interest, desire, or purpose. If you look at a beautiful painting and your first thought is, "I want to own that," you are not experiencing pure aesthetic pleasure, you are experiencing the desire of possession. If you look at a powerful, well-designed car and think, "That would be very useful for getting to work," you are not judging its beauty, but its utility. Even a moral interest corrupts the pure judgment of taste. A painting of a heroic act might be morally uplifting, but its goodness is separate from its beauty. For Kant, the experience of the beautiful is a moment of pure, contemplative freedom, a moment where our mind is at rest, simply appreciating the form of the object before us without wanting anything from it. This disinterestedness is what makes the pleasure so unique and so valuable, as it elevates us above our own selfish, practical concerns, contributing to a more refined and harmonious state of being for both the individual and society. The second feature of the beautiful follows directly from the first, because our pleasure is disinterested, because it's not based on any personal private inclination or desire. We feel that everyone else ought to agree with us. When I say, "This cake is delicious," I am only speaking for myself. I understand that you might not like it, but when I say, "This rose is beautiful," I am speaking with what Kant calls a universal voice. I am not just stating a personal preference. I am making a public claim. I am demanding that you, and every other rational being, should feel the same pure pleasure that I do, a demand that fosters a valuable sense of shared human experience. This leads to the third and most difficult moment of the judgment, the idea of purposefulness, without a purpose. When we look at a beautiful object, like a seashell or a perfectly formed crystal, it strikes us as having a profound and intricate design. The harmony of its parts, the elegance of its form, it all seems to work together perfectly, as if it were designed by a master craftsman for a specific purpose. But crucially, we cannot name what that purpose is. A beautiful object has the form of being purposeful without actually having any definite knowable purpose at all. This purposeless purposefulness is what triggers the unique pleasure of beauty. It sets our minds into a state of what Kant calls free play. Our imagination, which is free to apprehend the form of the object, and our understanding, which seeks to apply concepts to it, enter into a harmonious and delightful dance. The understanding can't quite fit the object into a neat conceptual box, and the imagination is not bound by any single definite purpose. It is this feeling of our own cognitive faculties working in perfect free harmony that we experience as the pleasure of beauty, a profoundly positive state of mind. The fourth and final feature is that we experience this pleasure as a necessity. We feel that the object must be considered beautiful, not because of a logical proof, but because we assume that all human beings share the same fundamental cognitive architecture. We assume the existence of a common sense, a shared capacity for this harmonious free play of the faculties, and therefore we feel that our judgment is not just a personal opinion, but a necessary and universal human response, a feeling that helps to bind us together as a community of feeling beings. So why is this experience of beauty so important to Kant's larger project? Why did he dedicate an entire critique to it? Because, he argues, the beautiful is the symbol of the morally good. Our experience of beauty is a kind of training ground for our moral lives, a gentle and pleasant introduction to the difficult demands of duty. And it does this in several profound ways, preparing us to be better, more cooperative, and ultimately happier members of society. First, the pleasure we take in beauty is disinterested, and so too is the action we take from duty. To be truly moral, we must act not for our own selfish advantage, but out of a pure, disinterested respect for the moral law. The experience of beauty allows us to practice this disinterestedness, to take pleasure in something that offers us no personal gain, thus cultivating the very disposition that is necessary for a virtuous life. It makes us less selfish, which has clear benefits for the well-being of all. Second, the judgment of beauty is universal. It makes us think from the standpoint of everyone else. When we judge something to be beautiful, we are moving beyond our own private feelings and making a claim about a shared, communal experience. This is precisely what the categorical imperative asks us to do, to take our own private maxim and see if it can be willed as a universal law for all rational beings. Beauty teaches us to think universally, a skill essential for both moral reasoning and a harmonious social life. Finally, the experience of beauty gives us a tangible, felt sense that the world of nature is not hostile to our moral aspirations. The fact that a natural object, like a flower, can feel so perfectly and purposefully designed, even though it has no purpose, gives us a hint, a symbol, that there is a deeper harmony between the world of what is and the world of what ought to be. It gives us a sensible intuition that the moral order we strive for in the kingdom of ends is not a hopeless fantasy, but is somehow rooted in the very fabric of existence itself, providing a sense of hope that is crucial for human flourishing. The feeling of beauty, then, is the great bridge in Kant's system. It is the place where the determined, natural world and the free, moral world come together in a harmonious and deeply pleasurable accord. It is a reminder that we are not just creatures of pure reason or of blind causality, but are also creatures of feeling, of imagination, and of a shared, communal sense of wonder. It is a quiet promise that the universe, in the end, is not a meaningless machine, but may well be a place of profound and ultimately beautiful purpose. In our last part, we explored Kant's theory of the beautiful, an experience of calm, harmonious pleasure that arises from the free play of our mental faculties. The beautiful, he argued, is a gentle and reassuring feeling, a symbolic hint that the world of nature is not hostile to our human purposes. It is a world of clear forms, of elegant designs, and of a quiet, disinterested delight. But our aesthetic lives are not only made up of such calm and harmonious experiences. What are we to make of our feelings when we stand before a raging, chaotic ocean, or at the foot of a mountain range so vast it seems to defy all measurement? These things are not, in the same way, beautiful. They are often formless, chaotic, and even terrifying. They do not bring us a feeling of calm pleasure, but a more complex, more disturbing, and more powerful emotion. A mixture of fear, awe, and a strange, exhilarating respect. This is the realm of the sublime, and Kant was one of the first philosophers to develop a profound and deeply subjective theory of this powerful human experience. He understood that the sublime is not a property of the object itself. It is not in the mountain or the storm. It is an event that takes place within our own minds. Kant divides the experience of the sublime into two distinct categories. The first is the mathematical sublime. This is the feeling that arises when we are confronted by something of immense, almost incomprehensible size or scale, something that is absolutely large, so large that our imagination simply cannot take it all in as a single coherent whole. Think of the great pyramids of Giza, of a vast, star-filled night sky, or of trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the Milky Way galaxy. These experiences overwhelm our sensory capacities. When we are faced with such immensity, a two-part psychological movement takes place within us. First, our faculty of imagination. The part of our mind that takes in sensory information and forms images, tries to grasp the object in its totality, but it fails. The object is just too big, the scale too vast. Our imagination is stretched to its breaking point, and then collapses. This failure of our sensory and imaginative powers is a moment of displeasure, a humbling reminder of our own finite, physical limitations. We feel small, insignificant in the face of such a colossal scale. But then, a second, more powerful faculty of the mind comes to the rescue. Our reason. While our imagination cannot picture a true infinity, our reason can think it. Our reason deals in concepts of totality, of the absolute, of the infinite. And in that moment of imaginative failure, we become aware of this superior power within ourselves. We recognize that even though our senses are limited, our reason is not. Our mind possesses a power that is greater than anything the sensible world can throw at it. The feeling of the sublime, then, is this dynamic movement from the displeasure of our failed imagination to the exhilarating pleasure of our triumphant reason. It is a feeling of respect, of awe, for our own cognitive powers. When we stand before the vastness of the ocean, we are, in a very profound sense, made aware of the even greater vastness of our own minds. The experience of the mathematical sublime reveals to us that our true nature is not just that of a small, finite physical being, but also that of a being whose reason is superior to anything in the world of sense. It is a humbling experience that, paradoxically, reveals our own greatness. The second category of the sublime is what Kant calls the dynamical sublime. This is the feeling that arises not from the immense size of an object, but from its immense, overwhelming power. This is the feeling we get when we are confronted with the raw, untamed, and potentially destructive forces of nature. Think of a hurricane with its howling winds, of a great volcano erupting, of a massive, thundering waterfall, or of a raging ocean with waves crashing against the cliffs. These are sights that reveal nature, not as a harmonious garden, but as a force of terrifying and irresistible might. The psychological movement here is similar. Our first reaction is one of fear. We are confronted with a power that could easily crush our small, fragile physical bodies. We feel a profound sense of our own physical helplessness in the face of nature's might, and this is the crucial condition for the experience of the sublime. We must be in a position of safety. If you are actually caught in the hurricane, you do not feel the sublime. You feel pure, unadulterated terror. But if you are watching it from a secure and solid shelter, your fear can transform into a feeling of awe. From this position of safety, we again become aware of a superior power within ourselves. We recognize that while the storm can destroy our physical, phenomenal self, it is absolutely powerless against our true, rational, noumenal self, the part of us that is a free and moral agent, our capacity to act from duty. Our status as a citizen in the kingdom of ends is a kind of power, a moral vocation that is infinitely superior to any mere physical force. No hurricane, no volcano, no raging ocean can touch the dignity of our moral will. The dynamical sublime, then, reveals to us our own supersensible moral destiny. It is a powerful emotional reminder that our true identity is not that of a creature of nature, but that of a free and rational being, who is in a moral sense superior to all of nature. It is a feeling of respect for the power of nature, but it is an even greater feeling of respect for the power and the dignity of our own humanity. It is a terrifying experience that ultimately empowers us by showing us that we possess something that no force of nature can ever take away. The contrast between the beautiful and the sublime is now clear. The beautiful is an experience of calm pleasure. It is found in objects that have a clear form and a sense of harmony, and it produces a feeling of kinship with nature. The sublime, on the other hand, is an experience of a disturbed pleasure, a negative pleasure. It is found in objects that are formless and overwhelming, and it produces a feeling of our own superiority over nature. The beautiful suggests that the world is a friendly and harmonious place, while the sublime reminds us that the world is a powerful and dangerous place, but that we ourselves are even more powerful in a moral sense. The sublime, even more than the beautiful, serves as the great bridge in Kant's system. It is a deeply moving, almost spiritual experience that gives us a direct, tangible feeling of the great truths of his philosophy. It is a sensible representation of our own supersensible nature. It is an emotional confirmation of what our pure reason has already told us, that we are citizens of two worlds, the determined world of nature and the free, more powerful world of morality. When we are confronted by the immense size or the terrifying power of the universe, we are not in the end crushed by our own insignificance. Instead, we discover a new and more profound respect for the immense power of our own reason and the absolute, unshakable dignity of our own moral will. It is a humbling and terrifying experience that paradoxically is the ultimate source of our own self-respect. In our last two parts, we explored the first half of Kant's great bridge between the world of nature and the world of freedom, the judgment of aesthetics. We saw how our feelings of the beautiful and the sublime provide a tangible, emotional hint of a deeper harmony between our minds and the world. But Kant knew that this was not enough. His bridge needed a second, more scientific and more systematic span, and he finds it in the second half of his critique of judgment, in his profound and deeply influential analysis of teleology, the judgment of purpose in nature. The central question is this: when we look at the natural world, we can explain many things through the simple mechanical laws of cause and effect, which his first critique had established. We can explain how a river erodes a canyon, how a rock falls to the ground, or how the planets move in their orbits. These are all examples of blind, mechanical causality. But when we look at an organism, a living being, a simple blade of grass, or a complex animal, a purely mechanical explanation seems strangely, profoundly inadequate. Consider the difference between a watch and a tree. We can understand a watch perfectly through mechanical causes. We can take it apart, see how each gear turns the next, and understand the whole by understanding its parts. But can we do the same for a tree? Kant argues that we cannot. A tree is not just a collection of parts, it is a self-organizing, self-generating, and self-preserving system. Every part of the tree exists for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists for the sake of the parts. The leaves exist to perform photosynthesis for the good of the entire tree, and the tree as a whole exists to produce more leaves. The roots draw nutrients to sustain the trunk, and the trunk provides the structure to support the roots and leaves. Unlike the watch, where the cause of its existence, the watchmaker, is external to it. A tree is its own cause and its own effect. It is what Kant calls a natural purpose, a system in which every part is both a means and an end for every other part. It seems to be governed not by blind causality, but by an internal, unifying purpose. But this presents a serious problem for Kant's system. His first critique proved that the only laws we can apply to the phenomenal world are the mechanical laws of cause and effect. The idea of a purpose, or a final cause, is not one of the categories of the understanding. So, how can we justify thinking about nature in this purposeful, teleological way? Kant's solution is as brilliant as it is subtle. He argues that we cannot say that nature is purposeful, for that would be to make a claim about the unknowable nominal world. Instead, he says, we must simply act as if nature were purposefully designed. Teleological judgment, for Kant, is a regulative principle. Not a constitutive one. It does not tell us what nature is, it tells us how our own reason ought to proceed in order to best understand it. It is a user manual for the human mind when it confronts the biological world. It tells us, assume that everything in an organism has a purpose, and then try to discover what that purpose is. It is a heuristic, a powerful and necessary fiction that guides our scientific inquiry. A scientist who approaches a strange organ in an animal by assuming it has some purpose is far more likely to make a discovery than a scientist who dismisses it as a random, meaningless accident. This as if thinking allows us to see the interconnectedness of biological systems, to view them as the coherent, self-organizing wholes that they appear to be. It is a way of making the living world intelligible to our particular kind of rational mind, a mind that cannot help but search for purpose and design. Kant is careful, however, to distinguish between two different kinds of purposefulness. The first is internal purposefulness, which is what we have just described in the tree. This is the idea that the parts of an organism exist for the sake of the organism itself, and Kant believes that this is a valid and indispensable principle for the study of biology. But there is a second, more speculative kind, which he calls external purposefulness. This is the old, naive argument from design, the idea that one part of nature exists for the purpose of another. This is the kind of thinking that leads one to say that the grass exists for the purpose of feeding cows, that cows exist for the purpose of feeding humans, and that the cork tree exists for the purpose of providing stoppers for our wine bottles. Kant is deeply skeptical of this kind of reasoning. He sees it as a form of human arrogance, an attempt to place ourselves at the center of creation and to assume that all of nature has been arranged for our personal convenience. We can never know if this is true, and it is a much weaker, less scientific form of judgment. But if we are to think of nature as a single, unified teleological system, our reason cannot help but ask one final, ultimate question. What is the ultimate purpose of nature itself? What is the final end of this great interconnected chain of purposes? For what ultimate reason does this whole system exist? The answer, Kant argues, cannot be something within nature, like human happiness, because happiness is a contingent, empirical thing that can be the result of blind chance. The ultimate purpose of nature must be something that has an unconditional, absolute worth. And, as we learned in his moral philosophy, there is only one thing in the entire world that has such an absolute, unconditional worth, and that is a human being, considered as a moral agent, a being capable of acting from a good will and legislating the moral law in a kingdom of ends. This is the great and breathtaking synthesis of Kant's entire philosophy, the ultimate purpose of nature, the final end that our reason must assume for it, is to produce the very conditions that make a moral life possible. Nature, with all its mechanical laws, is the stage, the arena in which free, rational beings can emerge and pursue their moral vocation. The world of what is, the world of science, can thus be seen as if it were designed for the sake of the world of what ought to be, the world of morality. The two great realms that Kant had so carefully separated, the determined world of the first critique and the free world of the second critique, are now finally and beautifully reunited through the bridge of this teleological judgment. We cannot know that this is true. It is not a scientific fact, but it is a necessary idea of reason, a way of seeing our own place in the cosmos that makes our moral striving feel rational and coherent, rather than a hopeless, meaningless struggle against a blind and indifferent universe. It allows the scientist who studies the mechanical laws of nature and the moral agent who strives to follow the law of freedom to be one and the same person, living in a single unified and ultimately meaningful world, a world where the starry heavens above and the moral law within are not two separate realities, but are two parts of a single grand and purposeful whole. Having constructed one of the most comprehensive and complex systems in the history of thought, a system that maps the very limits of knowledge, defines the absolute nature of morality, and explores the depths of our aesthetic feelings, Immanuel Kant now turns his powerful intellect from the inner world of the mind to the outer world of human society. He moves from the question, "What can I know?" to the equally important question, "How should we live together?" And he begins this final phase of our journey with a short, powerful, and profoundly influential essay that sought to define the very spirit of his age. A text that answered the great question, what is enlightenment? The essay opens with a definition that is at once a diagnosis and a call to arms. Enlightenment, Kant writes, is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. The motto of this great movement, he declares, is sapere aude, a Latin phrase meaning dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding. This, for Kant, is the very essence of the Enlightenment, and the key word here is courage. For the state of immaturity that he describes is not a lack of intelligence. It is a lack of resolve. It is a form of intellectual laziness and cowardice. He argues that it is simply so easy, so comfortable, to be immature, to not think for yourself. It is easy to let a book do your thinking for you, to let a pastor act as your conscience, or to let a doctor decide your diet. We allow these guardians, as he calls them, to take on the tiresome work of thinking. And they, in turn, are all too happy to oblige. They make it their business to ensure that the great herd of humanity, whom he compares to domestic cattle, never dares to take a single step without their guidance. They make the path to intellectual freedom seem not only difficult, but also very dangerous. But how can a society escape this comfortable prison of immaturity and begin the difficult journey towards enlightenment? Kant's answer is not a call for a violent political revolution, but for something much simpler and, in his view, much more powerful. The one and only thing required for enlightenment to flourish, he insists, is freedom, and specifically, the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. This distinction he makes between the public and private use of reason is the brilliant practical heart of his entire political philosophy. The private use of reason, he explains, is the reason that a person uses in their specific civil post or official capacity. In this private sphere, for the sake of order and efficiency, a person must obey. A soldier on duty cannot question the orders of his superior. A citizen cannot refuse to pay his taxes while the assessment is in effect. A priest is bound to teach the doctrine of his church to his congregation. This kind of obedience is necessary for a functioning society to avoid falling into a state of complete and total anarchy. But the public use of reason is the reason that this very same person uses when they are acting not as a cog in a machine, but as a scholar, as a member of the great worldwide community of learning, who is addressing the entire reading public. In this public sphere, Kant argues, reason must be absolutely, unconditionally free. The same soldier, when he is off duty, must have the absolute freedom to write an article criticizing the flaws in his army's strategy. The same priest, as a scholar, must have the freedom to publicly point out the faults in his own church's doctrine. And the same citizen must have the unlimited freedom to publish his thoughts on the injustice or imprudence of the taxes he is, in his private capacity, still obligated to pay. This brilliant distinction allows Kant to advocate for what seems like a paradox: a state of absolute obedience in one's professional role, and a state of absolute freedom in one's public intellectual role. It is a formula that allows for both social stability and the possibility of gradual, rational, and peaceful reform. Progress comes not from violent insurrection, but from the slow, steady, and transformative power of free and open public debate. Kant then asks the famous question, are we now living in an enlightened age? His answer is a masterpiece of realistic optimism. No, he says, we are not, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. He means that the process has begun, the path has been cleared. He sees in his own time, particularly under the rule of a monarch like Frederick the Great, a new willingness to allow for intellectual freedom. The obstacles to universal enlightenment are gradually being removed, and humanity is finally on its way to emerging from its long self-incurred childhood. The essay is a powerful and direct appeal to the rulers of his day. He argues that a wise monarch has nothing to fear from allowing his subjects this freedom of thought. In fact, he says, it is to the ruler's own advantage. For a public that is allowed to think for itself, to reason and to critique, is a public that is more capable, more mature, and ultimately easier to govern than one that is kept in a state of enforced ignorance and immaturity. A ruler who allows for freedom of thought in matters of the spirit, he argues, is himself enlightened. The final message of the essay, however, is not for kings, but for individuals. Enlightenment is not something that can be granted from on high. It is a personal and often difficult struggle that each and every one of us must undertake for ourselves. It requires, above all else, the courage to cast off the comfortable shackles of tradition, of dogma, and of the guardians who tell us what to think. It requires us to accept the full, terrifying, and ultimately glorious responsibility of being the those of our own understanding. What is enlightenment? Is more than just a historical document. It is a timeless manifesto for the power of critical thinking. It is a powerful reminder that the most profound form of tyranny is not the one that enslaves our bodies, but the one that chains our minds, and that the most profound form of freedom is the simple, difficult, and courageous act of daring to know. It is the foundational text for Kant's vision of a just and peaceful world, a world where the public use of reason can slowly but surely guide humanity out of the darkness of conflict and into the light of a perpetual peace. Having established a universal moral law grounded in the dignity of the individual, Kant now turns his gaze outward. From the inner kingdom of the soul to the chaotic, violent, and seemingly irrational kingdom of nations, in his great political essay, Toward Perpetual Peace, he asks a question that has haunted humanity for all of its history. Is a lasting peace between nations possible, or are we forever condemned to a cycle of brutal and meaningless conflict? His answer is not a utopian dream, but a practical, philosophical, and surprisingly modern blueprint for a more rational and peaceful world. He begins with a grimly realistic starting point, the state of nature between nations. He says, is not a state of peace, it is a state of war. This does not mean that nations are always actively fighting, but that the threat of war is always present, that international relations are governed, not by law, but by the principle that might makes right. Peace, he argues, is not the natural default state of humanity. It is something that must be actively, consciously, and rationally established. And to do this, he structures his essay like a formal peace treaty, laying out the necessary articles for its success. He begins with 6 preliminary articles. These are the immediate, necessary steps that nations must take to even make a genuine peace possible. They are the rules for ending the old, barbaric game of international conflict. First, no peace treaty is valid if it is made with a secret reservation for a future war. Second, no independent state can be acquired by another as if it were a piece of property, for a state is not a possession. It is a society of human beings who have a right to their own self-determination. Third, standing armies must be gradually abolished, for they are a constant threat to other nations. They encourage an arms race, and they make war an easy and tempting option for rulers. Fourth, nations must not take on national debts to fund their external conflicts, for war debt is a dangerous financial tool that makes the business of conflict far too easy to finance. Fifth, no state shall violently interfere in the internal constitution or government of another. And sixth, even during a war, certain acts must be forbidden, acts like assassination or the use of spies, because such dishonorable tactics destroy the trust that is necessary to ever make a genuine peace in the future. These 6 articles are the necessary groundwork, the basic rules of international decency. But for a peace that is truly perpetual, a deeper, more permanent structure is required, and for this, Kant proposes 3 definitive articles. These are the great institutional pillars upon which a lasting peace must be built. The first and most important is that the civil constitution of every state must be republican. This is the cornerstone of his entire plan. Now, when Kant says republican, he doesn't necessarily mean a democracy in our modern sense. He means a system of government with a separation of powers and, crucially, a system where the citizens have the power to consent to whether or not the nation goes to war. His logic is simple and powerful. In an absolute monarchy, the decision to go to war is an easy one for the ruler. He is not the one who will fight, he is not the one who will suffer, and he is not the one who will pay. He can decide to go to war as if it were a hunting party. But in a republican constitution, the citizens who must bear the true costs of war, who must fight on the battlefields, who must pay for the conflict through their taxes, and who must endure the sorrow of their losses, are the very same ones who get to make the decision. And Kant reasoned that these citizens, faced with such a terrible burden, would be far more cautious and far more reluctant to begin such a miserable game. A world of republics, he believed, would be a much more peaceful world. The second definitive article is that the law of nations shall be founded upon a federation of free states. Kant was not in favor of a single global superstate or a world government, which he feared would become a monstrous, soul-crushing despotism. Instead, he envisioned a voluntary league of peace, a federation much like our modern United Nations, where independent republican states would agree to give up their savage, lawless freedom and to submit their disputes not to the violence of war, but to the rational adjudication of a common set of international laws. The third and final article is that a cosmopolitan right shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. This does not mean that a state must treat a foreigner as a guest, but simply that it cannot treat him with hostility when he arrives on its territory. It is the right of any person to visit any part of the world without being seen as an enemy. A right that is based on the simple fact that we all have a common and shared possession of the surface of the earth. This principle, Kant believed, would foster global trade, communication, and a sense of a shared human community, all of which would ultimately work against the isolation and misunderstandings that lead to war. Finally, with a characteristic touch of dry humor and profound seriousness, Kant includes a secret article in his treatise. This article states that the maxims of the philosophers on the conditions of the possibility of public peace shall be consulted by states armed for war. This is his powerful and enduring plea for the importance of public reason, a theme from his essay on enlightenment. He is arguing that rulers must allow philosophers and citizens to think, to write, and to speak freely about the matters of war and peace, for it is only through the open, public, and rational debate of a mature and enlightened citizenry that a just and lasting peace can ever be achieved. Kant is not a naive idealist. He does not believe that this perpetual peace will be achieved because human nature is fundamentally good. Instead, he sees a guarantee for this future in the very mechanism of nature itself. Even if that nature is driven by our own selfish and often conflicting inclinations, the destructive, financially ruinous, and ultimately irrational nature of modern warfare, he believed, would eventually force even self-interested nations to see the rational benefits of a peaceful federation. Nature, he says, will drive us against our will towards the very state that reason commands us to choose. His vision is one of rational hope, a belief grounded not in a sentimental dream, but in a firm conviction in the power of human reason, the dignity of the person, and the slow, difficult, but ultimately undeniable arc of human progress. He has given us a blueprint, a practical, step-by-step plan to move humanity out of the barbaric, lawless state of nature between nations, and into a new, more rational, and more peaceful age, a world where our political structures finally begin to reflect the moral law that shines within each and every one of us. The work of a truly great philosopher does not end with the final page of their last book. It is not a closed system, but an event, an earthquake that permanently alters the landscape of thought. No philosopher in the modern era has created a more powerful or more inescapable earthquake than Immanuel Kant. After he published his 3 great critiques, it was no longer possible to do philosophy in the old way. The old debates between the Rationalists and the Empiricists had been rendered obsolete. He had created a new and profoundly challenging starting point for all future thought. The story of philosophy in the 19th century is, in large part, the story of his children, the generations of thinkers who grew up in the world that Kant had built and who spent their entire careers wrestling with the consequences of his revolution. They could not go back to the old dogmatic metaphysics that Kant had so thoroughly demolished, nor could they rest content in his new, more humble, and strictly limited world of knowledge. They accepted his Copernican revolution, but they could not accept its greatest and most frustrating consequence, the unknowable nominal world. Kant had created a profound and seemingly unbridgeable dualism, a split between the phenomenal world of appearances that we can know and the nominal world of the thing in itself that we can never know. This division, which Kant saw as a necessary act of intellectual humility, was seen by his immediate successors, the great German idealists, as an intolerable wound in the fabric of reality. Their entire philosophical project can be seen as a grand, romantic, and ambitious attempt to heal this Kantian rift, to find a way to tear down the wall between the phenomenal and the nominal, and to finally know the absolute. The first of these great idealists, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, took Kant's idea of the I think as the center of experience and radicalized it. He argued that the nominal world was not some mysterious external reality, but was in fact something posited by the activity of the self, the absolute ego. In his system, the entire universe, both the self and the world, is generated by the dynamic, self-creating activity of a single, universal consciousness. It was a bold attempt to overcome Kant's dualism by absorbing all of reality into the power of the subjective mind. But it was Kant's greatest and most influential successor, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who would take this project to its ultimate conclusion. Hegel accepted Kant's central premise, that the mind actively structures reality. But he completely rejected the idea of the unknowable thing in itself, famously declaring that real is the rational, and the rational is the real. For Hegel, there is no mysterious, unknowable reality hiding behind the curtain of appearances. Reality itself is a rational process, a great unfolding and knowable story, the story of what he called spirit, Geist. Hegel took Kant's static, unchanging categories of the understanding and made them dynamic, historical, and dialectical. He argued that reason itself evolves through history. Moving in a great logical progression of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, he saw all of human history, all of art, religion, and philosophy as the slow, difficult process of spirit coming to know itself. His vast, all-encompassing system is, in a sense, Kant's philosophy set in motion. A grand, romantic attempt to complete the revolution that Kant had started to show that the human mind can, in the end, know everything. But not all of Kant's children were so optimistic. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer also accepted Kant's great division of the world into phenomenon and noumenon, but he gave the unknowable thing in itself a new and terrifying name. He called it the will. A single, blind, irrational, and endlessly striving force that is the ultimate reality behind everything. For Schopenhauer, the world is not a rational process. It is the chaotic and ultimately pointless manifestation of a blind cosmic craving. It is a pessimistic and deeply anti-Hegelian twist on Kant's own system. Kant's influence, however, extends far beyond the German idealists who wrestled with his metaphysics. His radical emphasis on autonomy, on the freedom and responsibility of the individual to create their own moral law, became a foundational concept for the great existentialist thinkers who would follow. A philosopher like Søren Kierkegaard, with his focus on the individual's passionate, subjective leap of faith, is deeply indebted to Kant's idea of a moral life grounded in a free, personal choice that transcends pure reason. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously declared war on so much of the philosophical tradition, was operating on a fundamentally Kantian playground. His great project, the revaluation of all values, and his vision of the Übermensch, the man who creates his own values, is a radicalized, atheist, and deeply rebellious form of Kantian autonomy. The Übermensch is a man-god who is the sole legislator in his own personal kingdom of ends. A conclusion that would have horrified Kant, but one that was nonetheless born from the very seeds of freedom that he had planted. And his influence is not just confined to the grand continental traditions of philosophy. His meticulous, rigorous, and almost scientific analysis of the structure of knowledge, of the limits of language, and of the logic of our judgments laid the groundwork for the other great philosophical tradition of the 20th century, analytic philosophy. His insistence on clarity, on logical rigor, and on a careful mapping of the boundaries of sense and nonsense, became a central preoccupation for thinkers like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Beyond the world of academic philosophy, Kant's legacy is woven into the very fabric of our modern political and moral lives. His ethical system, with its absolute, unconditional respect for the dignity of the rational person, as an end in themselves, provides the single most powerful philosophical foundation for our modern concepts of universal human rights. His vision of a kingdom of ends is the utopian ideal that lurks behind our own democratic aspirations for a society of free and equal citizens. And his great political essay, Toward Perpetual Peace, with its call for a federation of free states and a cosmopolitan right, was a direct and acknowledged inspiration for the creation of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. It is a vision that continues to guide our own difficult and often faltering attempts to build a more peaceful and just international order. His ideas are not just theories, they are the architectural blueprints of the world we now inhabit. The quiet, humble professor from Königsberg, the man who lived a life of almost perfect uneventfulness, unleashed a set of ideas so powerful that they fundamentally and irrevocably changed the world. He is the great continental divide in the history of thought, and every major philosopher who came after him, whether they were a Hegelian, a Schopenhauerian, a Marxist, an existentialist, or an analytic philosopher, had to first define themselves in relation to the great, inescapable, and revolutionary system that he had built. He had, in a very real sense, created the modern mind. We have now traveled the full arc of Immanuel Kant's great philosophical revolution. We began with his awakening from a dogmatic slumber, and we have followed him as he systematically deconstructed and then rebuilt our understanding of knowledge, of morality, of beauty, and of politics. We have now arrived at the end of our journey, at the final grand vista that his entire system was designed to reveal, a vision he famously and beautifully summarized in the conclusion to his Critique of Practical Reason. "Two things," he wrote, "fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." This single immortal sentence is the key to his entire world. It is the declaration of his citizenship in two distinct and yet mysteriously connected realms, the world of nature and the world of freedom. Kant's entire life's work was a heroic attempt to do justice to both of these profound and awe-inspiring realities without sacrificing one for the sake of the other. The starry heavens above represents the first great world he charted, the world of his first critique. It is the phenomenal world, the vast, silent, and beautiful universe of science. A world governed by the strict deterministic and unbreakable laws of causality. It is a world that our own minds help to create, a reality structured by our innate forms of space and time and organized by our categories of the understanding. It is a testament to the immense power of human reason to comprehend and to map the intricate machinery of nature. But this world of the starry heavens, for all its grandeur, is a humbling one. It reveals my own physical insignificance. I am a mere speck of dust, a brief and accidental flicker of consciousness on a tiny planet in a forgotten corner of an incomprehensibly vast cosmos. I am a creature of nature, a part of the great causal chain. My body and my brain subject to the very same physical laws that govern the planets in their orbits. In this world, I am determined. I am finite, and I am in the grand scheme of things utterly unimportant. But then Kant tells us we must turn our gaze inward, to the second and even more awe-inspiring reality, the moral law within. This is the world of his second critique, a world that is not visible to our senses, but is revealed to us through the pure commands of our own practical reason. This is the nominal world, the world of freedom, where I am not a determined object, but a free and autonomous subject, a being capable of giving the law to myself, of choosing to act, not from my inclinations or my fears, but from a pure, rational, and unconditional sense of duty. This moral law reveals a value that is of a completely different order than my physical significance. It reveals my infinite worth, my dignity as a rational being, as an end in myself. In the world of morality, I am not a speck of dust. I am a sovereign legislator in the kingdom of ends, a citizen of a perfect, rational community. This inner world, Kant says, infinitely elevates my worth. It shows that I am not just a creature of nature, but a being with a supersensible destiny, a moral vocation that transcends the entire physical universe. Kant's philosophy, then, is a grand and sustained meditation on this dual citizenship. We are at one and the same time a determined part of the natural world, and a free member of a moral world. The great conflict that had torn philosophy apart, the war between science and morality, between determinism and freedom, is resolved not by choosing one over the other, but by showing that they are two different, non-competing standpoints from which we can view our own existence. We are the paradoxical, miraculous point where these two worlds intersect. And it is his third critique, the critique of judgment, that provides the final beautiful bridge between them. Our experience of beauty in nature gives us a gentle, harmonious hint that the world of what is not hostile to our moral strivings, and our experience of the sublime gives us a powerful, emotional confirmation of our own moral superiority over the immense power of nature. These feelings allow us to experience the world not as a fractured, contradictory reality, but as a single, coherent, and ultimately meaningful whole. So, what is Kant's final word? What is the ultimate lesson of his entire vast and difficult system? It is a message of profound rational hope and of a deep and abiding respect for the dignity of the human person. He has shown us that we do not need to prove the existence of God to have a sacred and absolute moral duty. The moral law within is its own unshakable foundation. He has shown us that we do not need to abandon science to believe in freedom, for we are citizens of two worlds. His legacy is a call to embrace this dual nature with courage and with clarity. It is a challenge to study the starry heavens above with the rigorous, unsentimental honesty of a scientist, accepting the truth of a determined causal universe, and at the very same time to obey the moral law within with the unwavering commitment of a saint, respecting the absolute, unconditional dignity of ourselves and of all others. To live in the tension of these two worlds, to be both a humble part of nature and a proud author of the moral law, is to achieve the full, difficult, and glorious measure of our humanity. The quiet professor from Königsberg, who rarely ventured outside his hometown, gave us a map of the entire universe. A universe that is both a magnificent, law-governed machine and a stage for the free and meaningful drama of our moral lives. His final answer is not a simple one. It is a call to a life of perpetual and productive tension, a life spent in constant, awe-filled contemplation of the two great wonders of existence, the silent, ordered cosmos without, and the commanding, legislative cosmos within.